There is a particular kind of American success story that gets told over and over. Someone starts at the bottom, works hard, climbs the ladder, achieves wealth and recognition. The story confirms that the system works, that effort is rewarded, that anyone can make it if they try hard enough. Charles Bukowski's life was not that story. Bukowski worked at the Los Angeles post office for nearly 12 years, sorting mail in a government building downtown. He drank heavily, lived in cheap rooms, wrote poetry, and stories that no one wanted to publish. By his late 40s, he had achieved nothing that American culture recognizes as success. No career, no stable family, no property, no respect. By conventional measures, he was a failure. Heinrich Karl Bukowski was born in Andernach, Germany, on August 16, 1920. His family moved to the United States when he was 3 years old, settling in Los Angeles during the early years of the Great Depression. The child who would become Charles Bukowski and later adopt the nickname Hank grew up in a household defined by violence and shame. His father, Henry Bukowski, was a milkman who had served in the American military during World War I. Henry was a man consumed by his own failures and disappointments, and he took those frustrations out on his son with systematic brutality. The beatings were not occasional outbursts, but regular occurrences, often carried out in the family's bathroom. Henry would fabricate reasons for these punishments, inventing infractions when real ones could not be found. He used a leather strap, and the sessions were methodical. This was not discipline in any recognizable sense. It was domination. The Bukowski household operated under a facade of lower middle-class respectability. Henry obsessed over the appearance of their small house and lawn, believing that maintaining these surfaces would somehow prove his worth in American society. He was an immigrant trying to belong, and he measured success by how well his grass was trimmed. The family lived in a working-class neighborhood, but Henry insisted they were better than their neighbors. This contradiction, the gap between what they were and what his father pretended they were, became one of young Bukowski's first lessons in recognizing social pretense. At school, Bukowski was tall and awkward. Then at 14, his face erupted. The acne was severe, not the typical teenage condition, but something closer to a medical crisis. His face became covered with boils and cysts that would leave permanent scars. He spent weeks in the hospital, where doctors applied painful experimental treatments. When he returned to school, his classmates avoided him. The condition marked him as different, as damaged, and this marking was permanent in its psychological effects even after the physical symptoms eventually subsided. The combination of abuse at home and isolation at school created something specific in Bukowski's psychology. He did not respond by trying harder to fit in or by developing compensatory social skills. Instead, he began to see his position outside the social structure as a place of clarity. The people who rejected him were not worth joining. The system that marked him as unacceptable was itself suspect. This was not a defensive rationalization that came later. You can see it forming in his earliest writing, in the attitude that would remain consistent for the rest of his life. Bukowski discovered literature in the Los Angeles Public Library. He read widely and without guidance, consuming everything from classical literature to pulp magazines. He paid particular attention to writers who depicted life without moral ornamentation. Hemingway's prose style impressed him. The direct, undecorated sentences seemed honest in a way that matched his own observations about how people actually behaved versus how they pretended to behave. At Los Angeles City College, Bukowski took some journalism and literature classes but showed little interest in academic achievement. He wrote for the college magazine, stories that were already identifiably his, focused on drunks and failures and the grinding nature of ordinary existence. His professors noticed his talent but also his refusal to meet conventional expectations. He left college without graduating, which would become a pattern. He walked away from structures when they demanded conformity. In his early 20s, Bukowski left Los Angeles and spent a decade wandering across America, taking temporary jobs and drinking heavily. He worked as a dishwasher, a truck driver, a stock boy, a shipping clerk. These were not colorful adventures, but repetitive experiences of exhaustion and humiliation. He lived in cheap rooms, spent his evenings in bars, and wrote stories that he submitted to magazines. The rejection slips accumulated. During this period, he developed a bleeding ulcer serious enough to require hospitalization. The doctors told him that continuing to drink would kill him. He kept drinking. By his mid-30s, Bukowski had stopped writing almost entirely. He was working at the post office in Los Angeles, a job he would keep for more than a decade. He had married briefly and fathered a daughter, but the marriage collapsed. He was living alone, drinking alone, working a job that required no thought and offered no future. By conventional measures, he had failed completely. He had no career, no stable relationship, no apparent prospects. Most men in this position would have continued the slow descent into complete obscurity. What changed was not circumstance, but decision. In his early 40s, Bukowski began writing again, but now with a different attitude. He was not writing to become a successful author or to prove anything to anyone who had rejected him. He wrote because the alternative was unacceptable. The life he was living, the repetitive work and solitary drinking would continue until he died, unless he created something else. Writing became the only form of resistance available to him. He started publishing in small underground magazines, the kind that paid nothing and had tiny circulations. The work was raw and deliberately offensive, filled with descriptions of hangovers, bad sex, violence, and boredom. It violated every rule of literary respectability, which was precisely the point. Bukowski had spent his entire life being told he was not good enough for respectable society, and now he was writing from that position, refusing to apologize for it or to translate his experience into something more palatable. The early readers who discovered Bukowski's work in these magazines recognized something unusual. This was not a writer slumming, not someone pretending to be rough for effect. The voice was authentic because it came from someone who had actually lived at the bottom and who had no interest in climbing out through literary success. He was not writing to escape his life, he was writing from inside it. By the time Bukowski reached his 50s, he had built an underground reputation. His poetry and short stories circulated among readers who were tired of academic literature and official culture. He was especially popular in Europe, particularly in Germany, where his uncompromising attitude and working-class perspective resonated with readers looking for alternatives to establishment literature. But in America, he remained largely unknown outside small circles. The outsider position that had been forced on him in childhood had become his permanent stance. He was not outside society because he had failed to get in. He was outside because he had looked at what was inside and decided it was not worth the price of admission. Everything that followed in his life and work came from this foundational rejection, this early understanding that the people in charge of deciding who mattered had no legitimate authority. The beatings from his father, the isolation caused by his acne, the years of rejection from magazines, none of it had convinced him to accept their judgment. Instead, it had convinced him that their judgment was worthless. The religion of work and why Bukowski rejected it. America in the 20th century organized itself around work. The job was not merely how you earned money. It was supposed to provide identity, purpose, social standing, and moral legitimacy. A man was defined by what he did for a living. The question, "What do you do?" was really asking, "Who are you?" And the acceptable answers came from a narrow range of occupations that signaled productivity and social contribution. Bukowski looked at this arrangement and saw it as a trap. The job was not a path to anything. It was the thing itself, the actual content of your life. You would spend the majority of your waking hours doing it. If the work was meaningless, then your life was being spent on meaningless activity, and no amount of money or social approval could change that fundamental equation. He had direct experience with this. During his years at the post office, Bukowski worked in the registry section, handling certified mail. The work required minimal skill and offered no possibility for advancement or creativity. You showed up, sorted mail, dealt with customers, went home. The next day was identical. This continued for years without variation. His co-workers accepted this as normal, as what work was supposed to be. They looked forward to their days off, to retirement, to the moments when they would not be working. Their actual lives were postponed, waiting for a future that would arrive only when the work finally ended. Bukowski refused this logic. He saw that his co-workers were trading their lives, the actual hours and days they had, for a paycheck and the vague promise of security. They had convinced themselves this was a fair exchange. They called it being responsible, being an adult, doing what you had to do. But Bukowski recognized it as a form of suicide, just one that happened slowly enough that people could pretend it was something else. The post office job had one advantage. It was mindless enough that he could do it while thinking about other things, and it ended at a specific time each day. When he left the building, he was finished. This was different from a career which demanded that you care about it, that you invest your identity in it, that you think about it even when you were not being paid. A career wanted all of you. The post office job wanted only your time, and Bukowski was willing to trade time for money as long as the exchange was clear and limited. The people who promoted the religion of work spoke in terms of fulfillment and self-actualization. They claimed that the right job could make you happy, that finding your calling was the path to a meaningful life. Bukowski considered this propaganda. Work was work. It was something someone paid you to do because they profited from your doing it more than they paid you. The entire structure was exploitative by design. Pretending otherwise was just a way to make people feel better about the exploitation. He noticed that the people most enthusiastic about work were usually either those who had never done truly degrading labor or those who had escaped it and now wanted to believe their escape was due to merit rather than luck. The businessman who started as a shop clerk and now owned the shop would tell you that hard work was the key to success, because admitting that chance and timing played a larger role would undermine his sense of having earned his position. The writers and artists who praised the dignity of labor were generally those who had never been trapped in it. They could romanticize the working class because they were not actually part of it. Bukowski was part of it, and he did not find anything romantic about standing behind a post office counter for 8 hours while people complained about postage rates. What angered him most was the moral dimension attached to work. If you did not have a good job, or if you were unemployed, this was treated as a character flaw. You were lazy, undisciplined, lacking in ambition. Society needed a way to justify inequality, and the religion of work provided it. The successful had worked hard, so they deserved their success. The unsuccessful had not worked hard enough, so they deserved their failure. This narrative ignored all the actual factors that determined who ended up where, but it was comforting to those who had ended up on top. Bukowski rejected both sides of this moral framework. He did not think having a job made you virtuous, and he did not think lacking a job made you deficient. Work was an economic transaction, nothing more. You sold your time because you needed money to survive. There was no shame in this, but there was also no glory. It was simply the arrangement society had created, and pretending it was something nobler was a lie that served the interests of employers. The question became what to do with this understanding. Some people recognized the trap but felt powerless to escape it. They complained about their jobs but kept showing up, kept trading their lives for paychecks because they could not imagine an alternative. Bukowski imagined an alternative. He would work only as much as absolutely necessary to survive, and he would reserve the rest of his time and energy for what actually mattered to him, which was writing. This required accepting a lower standard of living than he might have achieved by committing to a career. He lived in cheap apartments, drove old cars, wore the same clothes until they fell apart. He did not vacation in exotic locations or accumulate possessions. The trade-off was obvious. Less money meant more time. More time meant more writing. The writing was what justified his existence, not the job. People told him this was irresponsible. They said he should think about his future, save for retirement, build equity. Bukowski thought these people were missing the point. The future they wanted him to save for would arrive only after he had spent decades doing work he hated. By the time he retired, he would be old, his health damaged, his energy depleted. They were asking him to sacrifice his present for a future that might never arrive, or that would arrive only when he was too worn out to enjoy it. He chose to live in his present. If that meant being poor, he would be poor. If it meant being seen as a failure by people who measured success through career advancement, he would accept being seen as a failure. Their measurements were based on values he rejected, so their judgments carried no weight. The religion of work promised that if you worked hard enough, you would eventually be rewarded. Bukowski had worked hard at various jobs and had seen no rewards beyond subsistence wages. The promised rewards went to a small number of people, usually those who had started with advantages. For everyone else, hard work meant only that you worked hard. You did not get rich. You did not achieve security. You got tired, older, closer to death, with less and less time remaining for anything else. When Bukowski finally quit the post office at age 50, it was because a small publisher offered him $100 a month to write full-time. This was barely enough to survive on, less than he made at the post office. But it meant he would never have to sort mail again, never have to stand behind a counter dealing with people who treated him as an interchangeable service provider. He took the offer immediately, without hesitation. His friends thought he was crazy. He had a stable government job with benefits and a pension. He was walking away from security. Bukowski saw it differently. He was walking away from guaranteed misery. The job was killing him slowly, using up his days one shift at a time. The writing, even if it never earned him much money, was at least his. It came from him rather than being imposed on him. That difference was everything. Embracing the ugly, beauty in the mundane. Literature and art have traditionally concerned themselves with the beautiful, the noble, the exceptional. Writers describe sunsets and first love and the grandeur of nature. Painters captured idealized human forms and dramatic historical moments. The ugly, the boring, the sordid, these were considered unworthy of artistic attention except as moral lessons or as contrasts to highlight the beautiful. Bukowski rejected this hierarchy. He found beauty in places the established culture had declared off-limits. A drunk sleeping in an alley, a woman with bad teeth and nicotine-stained fingers, the inside of a cheap bar at 2 in the afternoon, these became his subjects. Not because he was trying to shock anyone, though he did shock people, but because these were the things he actually saw and experienced. To write about sunsets and noble sentiments would have been dishonest, a betrayal of his own life. The bars Bukowski frequented were not charming neighborhood pubs with warm lighting and friendly conversation. They were ugly places with sticky floors and harsh fluorescent lights. The regulars were not colorful characters with amusing quirks. They were damaged people drinking to manage pain or boredom or both. The conversations were repetitive and often hostile. The atmosphere was one of slow deterioration. But Bukowski paid attention to these places and found something in them worth recording. The bartender who had been pouring drinks for 30 years and knew every variation of human misery. The old man sitting alone who had outlived everyone he cared about. The woman who came in every day at the same time and drank the same thing while staring at nothing. These people existed. Their lives were as real as anyone's life. Ignoring them or treating them as unworthy of attention was a form of erasure. The post office where Bukowski worked was another place the culture preferred not to examine. Government buildings are necessary, but not interesting. The people who work in them are functionaries, part of the infrastructure, not individuals worth considering. Bukowski looked at his co-workers and saw people trapped in systems that ground them down. He saw the supervisor who enforced petty rules to feel powerful. He saw the clerk who had given up any ambition decades ago and now just wanted to reach retirement. He saw the whole mechanism of bureaucracy, the way it processed human beings and turned them into components. This was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it was true. And for Bukowski, truth was more important than beauty. Actually, he would have rejected the distinction. Truth was beautiful, not in the sense of being pleasant or uplifting, but in the sense of being real, of corresponding to what actually existed rather than to what people wished existed. The horse racing tracks were another location that fascinated him. These were not glamorous venues. The track he frequented, Hollywood Park, had sections where serious gamblers studied racing forms and calculated odds. The people there were not wealthy patrons out for an afternoon's entertainment. They were men, mostly, who needed to win. Some were trying to make a living from gambling, others were trying to recover losses. The atmosphere combined hope and desperation in equal measure. Bukowski loved the track. He loved the horses, the way they moved, the simple fact of their animal power. He loved the complexity of handicapping, the attempt to find patterns in chaos. But mostly, he loved the honesty of the place. At the track, you won or you lost. The result was clear and immediate. There was no pretense, no social performance. You placed your bet, the race happened, you collected or you walked away. This clarity was refreshing compared to the ambiguity and deception that characterized most human interactions. The women in Bukowski's life and writing were often described as unattractive by conventional standards. They were overweight or too thin, had crooked teeth or bad skin, drank too much, spoke crudely. The culture's idealized version of feminine beauty had no relation to these women. But Bukowski was drawn to them, wrote about them with attention and often with affection. Their lack of conventional beauty meant they did not expect to be treated according to romantic conventions. The interactions were more honest. Both parties knew what they were doing and why. This was not misogyny, though Bukowski has been accused of it. He did not hate women. He was suspicious of romance, of the social rituals that surrounded relationships, of the lies people told each other and themselves about love. The women he knew and wrote about were caught in the same traps he was, trying to get through life with whatever resources they had. Some were kind, some were cruel, all were human. He recorded this without pretending they were anything other than what they were. His living spaces reflected the same aesthetic. Small apartments with minimal furniture, no decoration, nothing that suggested an attempt to create an environment that would impress visitors. He owned what he needed and nothing more. The rooms were functional. This was not poverty as picturesque squalor. It was poverty as the actual condition of not having money, of living in spaces that landlords rented to people with limited options. The physical world Bukowski inhabited was marked by decay. Peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, buildings that needed repairs no one would pay for. Los Angeles in the mid-20th century had glamorous sections, but Bukowski lived in the other parts, the neighborhoods where people worked low-wage jobs and struggled to pay rent. These areas were not photogenic. They did not appear in movies except as locations for crime scenes. But they were real, and their reality had a kind of integrity. Nothing was hidden or dressed up. The ugliness was honest ugliness, not concealed behind a pleasant facade. Bukowski preferred this to the affluent neighborhoods where every lawn was maintained and every house presented a perfect exterior, while the people inside were just as miserable and dishonest as people anywhere else. Food in Bukowski's writing is rarely described as delicious. It is fuel. He ate at cheap diners, ordered whatever was filling and inexpensive. The meals were not events or experiences. They were necessities. This attitude extended to most physical comforts. He was not ascetic. He appreciated pleasure when it appeared, but he did not pursue luxury or refinement. Those things cost money and required a kind of performance he found exhausting. The mundane, the ordinary, the things everyone experiences but most writers ignored, these were Bukowski's material. Waiting in line, dealing with a landlord, nursing a hangover, listening to neighbors argue through thin walls. Everyone who has ever been poor or working class recognizes these experiences, but they rarely appeared in literature, which preferred to focus on the exceptional, the dramatic, the moments that seem significant. Bukowski understood that life was mostly not dramatic. Most of your time was spent doing things that were not important, that led nowhere, that would not be remembered. This was not tragic, it was simply what life was. And by paying attention to these moments, by recording them accurately, he was validating the experience of everyone who lived this way. Their lives mattered enough to be written about, to be turned into art. The ugliness in Bukowski's work was not there for shock value, it was there because he refused to lie. Beauty existed, but it was rare and usually fleeting. Most of what he encountered was ugly or at best neutral. To write only about the beautiful moments would have been to falsify the proportion, to suggest that life was something other than what it actually was. And yet, in paying such close attention to the ugly and mundane, something shifted. The descriptions themselves became compelling. The precision with which he captured a drunk's movements, or the particular quality of light in a cheap bar, or the rhythm of meaningless work, this precision was a form of beauty. Not the beauty of the thing described, but the beauty of seeing it clearly, of rendering it exactly. The art was in the attention, in the refusal to look away. The post office years, surviving the machine. Bukowski worked for the United States Postal Service for 11 years and 9 months. He started in 1952, quit, returned in 1958, and finally left for good in 1969. The job was at the Terminal Annex in downtown Los Angeles, a massive facility that processed mail for the entire region. He worked primarily in the registry section, handling certified and insured mail that required signatures and tracking. The work was not physically demanding in the way that construction or factory labor was demanding. You stood behind a counter or sat at a desk sorting envelopes, but the mental and emotional exhaustion was severe. Every day was exactly like the previous day. You arrived at the same time, performed the same tasks, interacted with the same coworkers, left at the same time. There were no variations, no surprises, no opportunities for creativity or independent decision-making. The Postal Service was a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies operate through rules and standardization. Every procedure had been specified in advance. There was a correct way to fill out each form, to process each type of mail, to interact with customers. These methods had been determined by people in offices elsewhere and handed down as regulations. Your job was to implement the regulations without deviation. Bukowski's supervisors were men who had dedicated their lives to the Postal Service. They had started as clerks and slowly advanced to positions of minor authority. They took pride in their knowledge of regulations and their ability to enforce them. Their power was limited and their status low, but within the terminal annex, they could make decisions that affected other people's days. Some exercised this power with restraint, others used it to compensate for their powerlessness everywhere else. The relationship between workers and supervisors was adversarial. Supervisors watched for violations of procedure, for workers arriving late or taking extended breaks or failing to meet productivity standards. Workers tried to find small ways to resist or subvert the rules without getting caught. Both sides understood the game. It was not personal, it was structural. The system required constant surveillance and minor rebellion to function. Customers who came to the registry window had usually encountered some problem that required them to be there. They had lost a package, or received damaged mail, or needed to send something with tracking. They were often frustrated before they arrived. Bukowski's job required him to remain polite and helpful while processing their requests according to regulations that were frequently inadequate to resolve their actual problems. The regulations had been designed for efficiency at scale, not for addressing individual circumstances. Some customers treated postal workers with basic respect. Others saw them as servants who deserved no courtesy. Bukowski learned to manage both types without reacting. Showing anger or frustration would only make the situation worse and might result in a complaint to a supervisor. The correct response was mechanical politeness, a refusal to acknowledge insults or to take anything personally. This emotional suppression, maintained for hours at a time, was its own form of labor. The terminal annex operated around the clock. Bukowski usually worked evening shifts, arriving in late afternoon and leaving near midnight. This schedule meant he avoided rush hour traffic and had mornings free, which became important when he started writing again. But it also meant his sleep schedule was permanently disrupted. He would get home after midnight, too wound up to sleep immediately, drink until he could pass out, wake in the late morning hungover, spend a few hours recovering, then go back to work. His co-workers fell into recognizable types. Some were lifers who had accepted that this job was their future and who tried to find small satisfactions in doing it well or in the camaraderie of shared misery. Others were trapped, people who hated the work but could not afford to quit and had no better options available. A few were actively counting days until retirement, treating each shift as one more unit of time to endure before escape became possible. Bukowski belonged to the second category. He hated the work and stayed only because he needed the paycheck. But unlike many of his co-workers, he refused to accept that this was simply how life had to be. He knew he was trapped, but he also knew the trap was not inevitable. It had been constructed by economic and social forces that could theoretically be different. This awareness did not make the work any easier, but it prevented him from fully submitting to it psychologically. The physical environment of the terminal annex was institutional. Fluorescent lights, linoleum floors, metal desks, filing cabinets, the smell of paper and ink and floor cleaner. Everything was functional and nothing was comfortable. The building was designed to process mail efficiently, not to provide a pleasant working environment for the people who processed it. You were part of the machinery, and machinery does not require comfort. Breaks were regulated and brief. 15 minutes in the morning, 30 minutes for lunch, 15 minutes in the afternoon. These intervals were not sufficient for actual rest. They were pauses, chances to use the bathroom and consume caffeine before returning to work. Bukowski usually went outside during breaks, stood in the alley behind the building, smoked, stared at the wall. The break was less about resting than about being momentarily outside the system. The work damaged people in ways that were not immediately visible. The repetition, the meaninglessness, the constant surveillance, these produced a particular kind of psychological erosion. Workers became numb, shutting down parts of themselves to make the days tolerable. They stopped expecting anything from their work except a paycheck. They stopped expecting anything from their lives except survival. This numbness was adaptive in the short term but catastrophic over years. Bukowski resisted this numbness by refusing to identify with his job. He was not a postal worker in the sense of making that his identity. He was someone who happened to work at the post office because he needed money. The distinction mattered. It meant he could maintain a sense of self separate from his role in the bureaucracy. His real life was what happened outside the terminal annex, and the job was simply something he endured to make that life possible. Other workers tried to make the job meaningful by taking pride in their efficiency, or their customer service, or their knowledge of regulations. Bukowski thought this was a mistake. It meant accepting the job's terms, agreeing that what happened inside the terminal annex mattered. He refused this acceptance. The work did not matter. It was not worth doing well. The only thing that mattered was getting through each shift with minimal effort and getting out. This attitude did not make him popular with supervisors. They preferred workers who cared about productivity and who internalized the organization's goals. Bukowski did the minimum required to avoid being fired, nothing more. He was not actively sabotaging anything. He was simply declining to give the postal service more than he was being paid for, and he was being paid for his time, not for his dedication or enthusiasm. The years accumulated slowly. 11 years is not a career, but it is a substantial portion of a life. Bukowski was in his late 30s when he started the job and pushing 50 when he left. Those are years when many men are advancing in their careers, building families, establishing themselves. Bukowski spent those years sorting mail, going home to drink, writing at night when he had the energy, trying to keep some part of himself alive that the job had not reached. The terminal annex represented something larger than just one workplace. It was a model of how industrial capitalism organized human labor. You took people with various skills and interests and experiences, stripped away everything that made them individual, and turned them into interchangeable components performing standardized tasks. The system was efficient at processing mail. It was disastrous at acknowledging human complexity or providing meaningful work. Bukowski understood that his experience was not unique. Millions of people worked similar jobs, spending their lives in offices or factories or warehouses performing tasks that meant nothing to them and that they had no control over. The system required this. It could not function if workers demanded meaningful activity or control over their labor. so it ground people down, normalized the grinding, convinced them this was just reality. When Bukowski finally quit, walking out of the terminal annex for the last time, he felt something close to liberation. He was broke. He had no security. He was 50 years old with no career prospects. But he would never have to go back to that building, never have to stand behind that counter, never have to perform the mechanical politeness and suppress the anger and waste another day feeding the machine. The poverty that followed was easier to bear than the employment had been. The Bottle and the Truth, Bukowski's complicated relationship with alcohol. Charles Bukowski was an alcoholic. This is not speculation or interpretation. He identified himself as an alcoholic, wrote about drinking constantly, and structured much of his life around access to alcohol. He started drinking seriously in his 20s and continued with brief interruptions until his death at 73. The alcohol damaged his body, complicated his relationships, and nearly killed him multiple times. Any honest discussion of Bukowski must address this directly. He was not a romantic drunk, not some charming bohemian with a wine glass. He drank cheap wine and beer, large quantities, daily. He drank to unconsciousness. He woke up sick and drank to manage the sickness. This was addiction, physical and psychological dependence, the standard progression that destroys millions of lives. Bukowski experienced the standard consequences. The bleeding ulcer that hospitalized him in his 20s, doctors telling him he would die if he continued drinking. The blackouts, losing hours or entire nights, waking up with no memory of what had happened. The hangovers that made every morning an ordeal, the damage to his liver, his stomach, his entire digestive system, the fights and bad decisions and destroyed relationships. His writing about alcohol was detailed and unflinching. He described the physical reality of heavy drinking, the nausea and headaches and weakness, the way your hands shake until you get the first drink down. He described the taste of cheap wine, the burn of hard liquor, the specific experience of drinking alone in a small room with nothing else to do. These descriptions were not celebratory, they were documentary. At the same time, Bukowski was clear that alcohol served a function for him. It reduced inhibition, which made writing easier. It numbed the anxiety and self-consciousness that made social interaction difficult. It made boring tasks tolerable. It created a distance between himself and his circumstances that felt necessary for survival. Without alcohol, he would have been more aware of how bad his life was, and that awareness might have been unbearable. This is the logic of addiction. The substance creates problems, but it also provides temporary relief from the problems it creates and from pre-existing problems. The relief is real even though it comes at catastrophic cost. Telling an addict to simply stop using does not work because it fails to address what the substance is doing for them, what needs it is meeting, however poorly. For Bukowski, alcohol was connected to his identity as a writer. Most of his work was produced while drinking or while recovering from drinking. The bohemian mythology surrounding artists and alcohol provided some justification, but more fundamentally, drinking was part of the lifestyle he had chosen. He was not going to be sober and respectable. He was going to live outside conventional norms, and drinking was one way to mark that position. His relationship with alcohol changed over time. In his younger years, drinking was rebellion and adventure, part of exploring the underground bars and rough neighborhoods. In middle age, it became routine, something he did every day because he had always done it, and because stopping seemed impossible. In later years, after he had achieved success and married Linda Lee, his drinking moderated somewhat. He still drank, but with less of the desperate intensity that had characterized earlier periods. The hospitalization for the bleeding ulcer was a turning point, though not in the way hospital visits are supposed to be. Bukowski nearly died. The doctors told him explicitly that continuing to drink would kill him. He stopped drinking for a while, followed medical advice, recovered. Then he started drinking again. Not immediately, but eventually. He had experienced the medical consequences, understood them intellectually, and decided the drinking was worth the risk. This was not ignorance. It was choice, or as close to choice as addiction permits. Some of Bukowski's defenders romanticize his drinking, treating it as part of his artistic authenticity. This is a mistake. The drinking was a serious problem that caused him real harm. It was not colorful or charming. It was pathological behavior driven by addiction. The fact that he wrote well while drinking does not change this. Many alcoholics are functional in various ways. That does not make the alcoholism acceptable or sustainable. Critics sometimes dismiss Bukowski's work by pointing to his alcoholism as if the addiction disqualifies everything he wrote. This is also a mistake. Addiction does not erase your perceptions or invalidate your experiences. Bukowski saw clearly despite the drinking, perhaps because the drinking removed some of the psychological defenses that prevent people from seeing clearly. His work is valuable not because of the alcohol, but in spite of it. The question of whether Bukowski could have written as well without drinking is unanswerable. He He never seriously tried to write sober for an extended period. He believed he needed alcohol to write, and that belief shaped his behavior. Whether it was objectively true or just something he told himself to justify the addiction cannot be determined. What is clear is that the cost was enormous. Decades of physical damage, relationships destroyed or damaged, financial instability made worse by spending money on alcohol, the wasted time and the morning sickness, and the constant low-level misery of maintaining an addiction. Even if the drinking contributed to the writing, the exchange rate was terrible. Bukowski wrote about other alcoholics with a combination of recognition and pity. He knew the signs, the progression, the end stage. He watched people drink themselves to death, documented it in his work. He understood that this was where his own path was leading. The awareness did not produce sobriety. It produced more material for writing, more observations about the human capacity for self-destruction. There were moments of clarity when Bukowski acknowledged that the drinking was unsustainable. Usually these came during medical crises, when the physical damage could not be ignored. He would cut back for a while, drink beer instead of hard liquor, try to moderate. These periods never lasted. The addiction was stronger than the intention to control it. In his final years, married to Linda Lee and living in a large house in San Pedro, Bukowski's life was more stable than it had ever been. He still drank, but the chaos that had surrounded his earlier drinking was gone. He was no longer getting into fights at bars or waking up in strange places or destroying relationships through drunken behavior. The addiction had not disappeared, but its expression had changed. He died of leukemia, not from alcohol-related disease. The alcohol had damaged his body extensively, but it was cancer that killed him. Whether his decades of drinking contributed to the cancer is unclear. What is clear is that he lived longer than many people with similar drinking patterns, and that his death at 73, while not old by current standards, was older than many expected him to reach. Bukowski's relationship with alcohol cannot be simplified into a moral lesson or a romantic myth. It was a destructive addiction that he lived with for most of his life, that shaped his experience and his writing, that he never fully escaped from or fully controlled. The drinking was real, the damage was real, the addiction was real. Any understanding of Bukowski that ignores this or romanticizes it is failing to see him accurately. Women, love, and the impossibility of connection. Bukowski's relationships with women were characterized by intensity, conflict, and recurring patterns of connection and dissolution. He was married twice, had numerous relationships outside of marriage, and wrote extensively about women and sex and the difficulty of maintaining intimate connections. The writing is often crude and sometimes hostile, leading to accusations of misogyny, but the actual picture that emerges from his life and work is more complicated. His first serious relationship was with Jane Cooney Baker, called Jane in his writing, though he sometimes changed her name. He met her in the early 1950s when both were in their 30s. Jane was an alcoholic, probably more severely dependent on alcohol than Bukowski was at that point. She had been married twice before and had a daughter. She lived in poverty and drank constantly. Bukowski and Jane lived together off and on for several years. The relationship was marked by heavy drinking on both sides, frequent arguments, and periods of separation. Jane would leave, or Bukowski would leave. One or the other would end up with someone else briefly, then they would reconnect. Neither could quite leave permanently. The relationship was destructive, but also provided something neither could find elsewhere, possibly just the recognition that comes from another person who is equally damaged. Jane appears throughout Bukowski's poetry and fiction, usually portrayed with a combination of affection and brutality. He wrote about her drinking, her aging body, her emotional needs that he could not meet. He also wrote about his own inadequacy in the relationship, his inability to provide stability or tenderness, his tendency to withdraw or become cruel when confronted with emotional demands. Jane died in 1962, likely from alcohol-related causes, though the specifics are unclear. Bukowski was devastated. He had left her before her death, was living elsewhere, but her death affected him deeply. She became a recurring figure in his work, a lost possibility, someone he had loved in the only way he knew how, which had not been enough. His first marriage was brief and appears to have been primarily about providing stability for his daughter. He married Barbara Fry, a poet from a wealthy family, in 1955. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Fry's family had money and education, backgrounds completely alien to Bukowski. The class difference created tension. Fry wanted a conventional marriage. Bukowski was incapable of providing one. The marriage ended badly, with anger on both sides. After Jane's death and the collapse of his first marriage, Bukowski spent most of the 1960s living alone, working at the post office, drinking, writing, and having occasional brief relationships with women he met at bars or through the underground literary scene. These relationships followed a pattern: initial attraction, usually physical, a period of intensity, growing frustration as Bukowski's inability to maintain consistent emotional engagement became apparent, dissolution, often with hostility. He wrote about these women, and the writing was rarely flattering. He focused on physical details, usually imperfections. He described sex mechanically, without romance. He portrayed women as demanding, irrational, or manipulative, but he also portrayed himself as inadequate, cowardly, unable to connect, fleeing from intimacy even as he sought it. The accusations of misogyny are not entirely unfair. Bukowski wrote about women's bodies with a crudeness that many find offensive. He described relationships primarily from his own perspective, rarely giving women's interior lives much consideration. He traded on male-oriented fantasies of freedom from domestic obligation. But calling him simply a misogynist oversimplifies what is happening in the work. Bukowski did not hate women. He feared intimacy and emotional vulnerability. Women represented the possibility of connection, which he wanted, and the demand for emotional openness, which he found terrifying. His relationships failed not because he despised women, but because he could not give them what they reasonably wanted from a relationship, things like consistency and emotional honesty and partnership. He was capable of affection and even tenderness, but these were usually expressed obliquely, through gesture rather than declaration. He was suspicious of romantic language, saw it as performance rather than truth. When he wrote about caring for someone, it came out as description of practical action, making dinner or driving someone somewhere, rather than as statement of feeling. In 1976, at age 55, Bukowski met Linda Lee Bale. She was younger, had been married before, was interested in health food and fitness, things completely foreign to Bukowski's lifestyle. The relationship developed slowly. Linda was patient with his drinking and his need for solitude. She did not demand that he change, but she also established boundaries about what she would and would not accept. They married in 1985 when Bukowski was 64. The marriage lasted until his death in 1994. By all accounts, it was stable in a way his previous relationships had never been. Linda managed the practical aspects of his life, dealt with publishers and agents, maintained the household. Bukowski continued to write, but the chaos that had characterized his earlier years was gone. This final relationship succeeded partly because both parties had realistic expectations. Linda knew who Bukowski was, what he was capable of, and what he was not capable of. She was not trying to change him into someone different. Bukowski, for his part, had reached an age where the restless pursuit of new experiences had lost its appeal. He wanted stability more than he wanted freedom, or had learned that the two were not necessarily opposed. Throughout his work, Bukowski returned obsessively to the theme of failed connection. Two people come together, experience brief intensity, then discover they cannot maintain it. The reasons vary, but the outcome is consistent. Someone leaves or someone is driven away. The relationship ends in anger or exhaustion or simply fades out. He rarely blamed only the women. His portrayal of himself in relationships was usually of someone who withdrew at crucial moments, who drank too much and said cruel things, who could not provide emotional support or stability. He recognized his own role in the failures even if he could not change the behavior that caused them. The sex in Bukowski's writing is frequent and graphic and almost never romantic. It is described as physical act, bodies meeting with temporary intensity, providing brief relief from loneliness without creating actual intimacy. This was apparently how he experienced it. Sex was not a path to connection, but a temporary substitute for connection, something two people did together while remaining essentially separate. His attitude toward love was skeptical. He had seen too many people destroy themselves pursuing it or staying in relationships that made them miserable. He had tried and failed too many times to believe in love as it was conventionally described. But he continued to seek out relationships, continued to try to connect despite his pessimism about the possibility. The contradiction was never resolved. Bukowski needed other people, specifically needed women, but could not sustain the emotional demands of partnership. He wrote about this inability constantly, examining it from multiple angles, but examination did not produce solution. The pattern repeated through most of his life until Linda, and even that relationship succeeded partly because she accepted his limitations rather than trying to overcome them. Women readers of Bukowski have varied reactions. Some find the work irredeemably misogynistic, the fantasy of a man who resented women for not accepting his refusal to be a functional partner. Others recognize in the writing an honest portrayal of damaged relationships between damaged people, neither party entirely at fault, both trapped in patterns they could not escape. What seems clear is that Bukowski understood intimacy primarily as a threat to autonomy. Getting close to someone meant they could make demands on you, could expect things from you, could be disappointed in you. Keeping distance was safer, but distance was also lonely. He oscillated between these poles, never finding a stable position until very late in life. Writing as survival, the creative act as necessity. Bukowski did not write to achieve literary success or to build a career. He wrote because not writing was unacceptable. The distinction is important. It meant he was not oriented toward markets or critics or literary trends. He was oriented toward getting words onto paper, filling the page, producing work that satisfied his own sense of what was needed. He started writing seriously in his 20s during his years of wandering and taking temporary jobs across America. He wrote stories and submitted them to magazines. The rejection slips accumulated, hundreds of them, from every type of publication. The feedback, when there was any, suggested that his work was too crude, too explicit, too focused on unpleasant subjects. Editors wanted stories with structure and redemption, characters who learned something or changed. Bukowski's characters did not change. They drank and suffered and died. After accumulating enough rejections, Bukowski stopped writing. This was in his early 30s. He had tried to become a writer and failed. The market had delivered its judgment. He took the job at the post office and accepted that writing was not going to be part of his future. For about 10 years, he produced almost nothing. What brought him back to writing was not ambition, but desperation. By his early 40s, working at the post office and living alone, Bukowski faced the reality that his life would continue exactly as it was until he died or until he created some alternative. The job would not improve. Relationships were brief and unsatisfying. He had no money and no prospects. Writing reappeared not as a career option but as the only available form of resistance. He started publishing in small magazines that paid nothing and had tiny readerships. These were underground publications, mimeographed and stapled, distributed through mail order to a few hundred people. The editors were not professionals. They were enthusiasts who liked challenging work and did not care about offending mainstream sensibilities. They published Bukowski because they recognized that what he was doing was genuinely different from conventional literature. The work he produced during this period was raw, short stories about working at the post office, about drinking alone, about sex with women he barely knew, about the grinding tedium of existence. Poetry that was structurally simple, almost prose broken into lines, but with a directness that was unusual. There was no self-pity in the work, but there was also no attempt to make the material palatable or to find redemption in suffering. Bukowski wrote quickly, usually at night after work, often while drinking. He did not revise extensively. The idea was to capture something directly, to get it down before it disappeared. This approach violated the established wisdom about craft, which emphasized revision and polish and careful construction. Bukowski's response was that careful construction produced dead prose. The energy came from immediacy, from the words arriving on the page while the experience was still fresh. His productivity was extraordinary. Stories, poems, letters, notes, constantly producing text. Some of it was better than other parts, but all of it came from the same compulsion. He needed to write the way other people needed to eat or sleep. It was not optional. The small magazines brought him a cult following. People who read his work in these publications recognized that they were encountering something genuine. They had read plenty of literature about suffering and poverty, usually written by people who had studied those topics but not lived them. Bukowski was writing from inside the experience, and the difference was obvious. By his late 40s, small publishers started releasing collections of his poems and stories. These were not commercial publications. They were limited editions, sometimes hand-bound, distributed mainly through the underground literary network, but they established Bukowski as a presence in the alternative literary world. He had readers who actively sought out his work and who promoted it to others. The turning point came when John Martin, who ran Black Sparrow Press, offered Bukowski $100 a month to quit the post office and write full-time. This was 1969, when Bukowski was 49 years old. $100 a month was barely enough to live on, less than he made at the post office. But it meant he could write without having to sort mail 8 hours a day. He accepted immediately. The decision to quit the post office and commit to writing full-time was a gamble. Bukowski had no guarantee that he could support himself. The monthly payment from Black Sparrow helped, but he would also need income from publications. The alternative was returning to some other form of wage labor if the writing did not generate enough money. At 49, with no other skills and a sporadic work history, his employment options were limited. He took the gamble. For the first time in his adult life, writing was not something he did in stolen hours after work. It was his work. He treated it as such, maintaining a schedule, producing pages every day. The output increased substantially. Black Sparrow published his books regularly. His readership grew. Bukowski wrote primarily for himself, but he also wrote for the people who recognized themselves in his work. The readers who had also worked terrible jobs, who drank too much, who struggled with loneliness and meaninglessness. He was giving them something the mainstream culture did not provide, which was acknowledgement that their experience was real and worth recording. His success, when it came, was unexpected. By his 60s, Bukowski was no longer an underground figure. His books sold widely. He was translated into multiple languages and became especially popular in Europe. Hollywood made a film based on his life. He earned more money than he had ever imagined having. None of this had been the goal. It happened because he had continued to write year after year, regardless of external validation. The motivation throughout was necessity. Bukowski needed to write the way other people need to talk or to be around others. It was how he processed experience, how he made sense of what happened to him, how he maintained some control over his own life. Without writing, he would have been just another person ground down by work and alcohol and loneliness. Writing transformed the experience into material. The transformation did not make the experience less painful, but it gave it purpose. Late in life, successful and financially comfortable, Bukowski continued to write every day. The habit was unbreakable. He no longer needed the money. He no longer needed to prove anything. But stopping was not an option. Writing had become who he was, and stopping would have been a form of death. Dirty realism, writing and living without bullshit. Bukowski's writing was deliberately crude. He used profanity, described bodily functions, focused on sex and violence and drinking. This was not accidental or careless. It was a conscious rejection of literary respectability and the polite fictions that characterized mainstream literature. The literary establishment in the mid-20th century valued refinement and sophistication. Good writing was supposed to be well-crafted, with careful attention to language and structure. Subject matter was supposed to be meaningful, exploring important themes through complex characters. The prose was supposed to be beautiful, showing the writer's skill with metaphor and description. Bukowski looked at this set of values and rejected all of it. He did not think careful craft produced truth. He thought it produced performance, writing that showed off the writer's abilities rather than communicating anything essential. He did not think beautiful prose was valuable if it was describing things that were not beautiful. And he definitely did not think the themes the literary establishment considered important were actually important. His prose style was simple almost to the point of being simplistic. Short sentences, basic vocabulary, minimal description. The focus was on action and dialogue, on what happened and what people said, not on the narrator's interpretation of these events. This style resembled journalism more than it resembled literary fiction, which was exactly the point. He was reporting on what he had seen and experienced, not transforming it into art through elaborate technique. The critics who dismissed Bukowski's work often pointed to this simplicity as evidence that he was not a serious writer. They said he lacked sophistication, that his work was crude and unpolished. Bukowski agreed that his work was crude. He disagreed that this was a problem. Sophistication, in his view, was usually just a way to disguise the lack of anything real to say. What he was doing had a name in literary criticism: dirty realism. The term referred to a style that focused on working-class life, mundane details, and characters without heroic qualities. It was realistic but deliberately ugly, refusing to aestheticize poverty or suffering. Writers associated with this movement included Raymond Carver, Richard Ford, and Tobias Wolff, though the connections between them were loose. Bukowski was a more extreme version of dirty realism than most of his contemporaries. He was not just depicting working-class life, he was depicting the absolute bottom, people who had failed completely, whose lives had no redemptive qualities, and he was depicting himself as one of these people, not as an observer visiting from another social class. The authenticity of the writing came from lived experience. Bukowski had worked the terrible jobs, lived in the cheap apartments, spent nights in the bars he described. He was not researching this material, he was recording his own life. This gave the work a quality that could not be faked. Readers who had similar experiences recognized the accuracy immediately. The writing was also authentic in its refusal to provide moral comfort. Most literature about poverty and suffering suggests that these experiences teach important lessons, or build character, or lead to insight. Bukowski's work suggested that suffering just made you tired and that poverty was degrading without being enlightening. There was no redemption, no growth, no silver lining. This absence of redemption disturbed many readers and critics. They wanted stories about poor people who maintained their dignity or who overcame their circumstances through determination. Bukowski's characters did not overcome anything. They endured and then died. This felt nihilistic, as if he was saying that nothing mattered and that life had no meaning. But Bukowski was not promoting nihilism as a philosophy. He was describing what he had observed. Most people did not overcome their circumstances. Most people did not learn important lessons from their suffering. They just suffered and got older and died. This was not a moral claim about how things should be. It was a factual claim about how things were. The authenticity extended beyond subject matter to voice. Bukowski wrote the way he talked. There was no literary persona, no elevated language, no attempt to sound educated or cultured. The voice was direct, profane, often bitter, occasionally funny. It was the voice of someone who had been excluded from respectable society and who had stopped caring about that exclusion. This voice appealed especially to readers who felt similarly excluded. Young men who worked dead-end jobs, who drank too much, who had trouble with relationships, found in Bukowski's work a reflection of their own experience. He was not talking down to them or offering advice about how to improve their lives. He was simply saying that their lives were real and worth writing about. The accusation of being unpolished or lacking craft missed the point. Bukowski had craft. He knew how to structure a story, how to create rhythm in a line, how to use repetition for effect. He chose simplicity deliberately, not because he was incapable of complexity, but because complexity would have betrayed the material. The lives he was describing were not complex. They were simple and repetitive and hard. His approach to truth-telling extended to his portrayal of himself. Most autobiographical writing presents the author in a favorable light, or at least in an interesting light. The author is the hero of their own story, struggling against circumstances, making difficult choices, learning from mistakes. Bukowski presented himself as frequently cowardly, cruel, self-destructive, and pathetic. He wrote about getting drunk and saying terrible things to women. He wrote about being too afraid to quit his job when he hated it. He wrote about failing to help friends who needed help. He wrote about his jealousy of more successful writers. He presented all of this without excuses or explanations. This was who he was. Readers could judge if they wanted. He was not interested in managing their perception of him. This radical honesty was unusual enough to be shocking. People are trained to present themselves well, to emphasize their virtues and minimize their flaws. Bukowski did the opposite. The effect was that when he did write about moments of decency or kindness, they carried more weight because they were not part of a campaign to make himself look good. The writing was also honest about what motivated him. He did not claim to write for noble reasons, to improve society, or to explore the human condition. He wrote to survive, to make money, to avoid having to work regular jobs. This admission of mercenary motives was itself a form of honesty. Most writers present their work as driven by higher purposes. Bukowski said he wrote because he had to eat. The literary establishment never fully accepted Bukowski. He won no major awards, received no academic positions, was not included in prestigious anthologies. This rejection did not bother him. He had never wanted acceptance from people whose values he rejected. The underground and counterculture embraced him, and that audience was sufficient. His influence on subsequent writers was substantial. Many authors in the late 20th and early 21st centuries adopted elements of his style, the direct prose and working-class subjects and willingness to portray ugliness. Some did this well. Others just imitated the surface, the drinking and the profanity, without understanding the underlying commitment to honesty that made Bukowski's work effective. The key to understanding dirty realism as both a writing style and a way of living is recognizing that it requires giving up certain comforts. The comfort of seeing yourself as a good person, the comfort of believing your suffering has meaning, the comfort of thinking that if you just try hard enough, things will improve. Bukowski gave up all these comforts. What he got in exchange was the ability to see clearly and to write what he saw without filtering it through wishful thinking. Loneliness as a lifestyle choice. Most people treat loneliness as a problem to be solved. They seek out relationships, join groups, maintain social connections, because isolation is understood to be unhealthy and undesirable. Bukowski approached loneliness differently. He cultivated it, protected it, returned to it repeatedly, even when opportunities for connection were available. This was not because he enjoyed being alone in any simple sense. He experienced loneliness, wrote about it extensively, acknowledged its pain, But he preferred that pain to the pain of dealing with other people. The equation was clear. Interaction with others required performance, compromise, attention to their needs and expectations. Solitude required nothing. The choice was obvious. After his early relationships ended badly, Bukowski spent long periods living alone. Small apartments, usually just a room or two, no telephone for years, no visitors except occasionally. He would work his shift at the post office, come home, drink, write if he had the energy, sleep, repeat. Days could pass without him having a conversation beyond the minimal exchanges required at work. The solitude provided certain advantages for writing. No interruptions, no one making demands on his time or attention, no need to explain what he was doing or why. He could maintain whatever schedule suited him, drink as much as he wanted, work in the middle of the night, if that was when the words came. The life was organized entirely around his own needs and preferences. But the solitude also reflected fear. Bukowski was afraid of intimacy, of letting someone get close enough to hurt him. Everyone who had been close to him had either left or died or had been driven away by his behavior. The pattern was clear. Connection led to loss. Maintaining distance was safer, even if safety meant being alone. His apartments were barely furnished. A bed, a table, a chair, sometimes a desk. No decoration, nothing that suggested an attempt to create a home. These were places to exist, not places to live in any full sense. The minimal environment matched the minimal social life. Both were stripped down to essentials, with everything unnecessary removed. He wrote about loneliness without self-pity, but also without pretending it was fine. The work acknowledged that isolation was difficult, that days alone in a small room could be oppressive, that the absence of human contact created a particular kind of emptiness. But it also suggested that this emptiness was preferable to the alternatives he had experienced. Relationships required things from him that he either could not or would not provide. Emotional availability, consistency, consideration for another person's needs. These demands felt like impositions. Being alone meant not having to meet anyone else's expectations. He could be exactly as selfish and self-centered as he wanted without hurting anyone else or having to justify himself. The post office job intensified the isolation. He worked evening shifts, which meant his schedule was opposite most people's. When others were socializing, he was at work. When he had free time, others were sleeping or at their own jobs. The shift work created a natural barrier between him and conventional social life. He also chose isolation strategically to protect his writing time. If he had maintained an active social life, the time and energy required would have reduced his productivity. Friends would have expected him to show up for events, to help with problems, to reciprocate attention and care. All of that would have taken away from writing. The writing was more important than friendship. This prioritization is common among serious artists. The work demands so much that other aspects of life get neglected. But most artists at least pretend to regret the neglect, to wish they had more time for relationships. Bukowski did not pretend to regret it. He was clear that he preferred solitude and that other people were mostly irritations to be avoided. His few long-term friendships were maintained primarily through letters rather than in-person contact. He corresponded with other writers and with some dedicated readers. The letters allowed for connection without the demands of physical presence. You could write when you wanted, say what you wanted, and did not have to deal with the other person's immediate reactions. When he did socialize, it was usually in bars. The bar as a social space appealed to him because interactions there were temporary and superficial. You could have a conversation with someone, even enjoy their company briefly, and then leave. There was no expectation of ongoing relationship. Everyone was there to drink, and conversation was just something that happened incidentally. The people he met in bars were often as isolated as he was. Regular drunks, people killing time, others without stable relationships or conventional lives. There was an unspoken understanding among them that no one was there to make real friends. The companionship was circumstantial, lasting only as long as everyone remained in the bar. Even these limited social interactions could be too much. Bukowski would go through periods of extreme withdrawal, avoiding bars, not answering his door, having no contact with anyone for weeks. The solitude during these periods was total, just him and whatever alcohol he had on hand and the blank page. The relationship between his loneliness and his drinking was complicated. Alcohol made the loneliness more bearable by numbing the emotional discomfort. But drinking alone is a particularly isolating activity. The more he drank, the less capable he became of maintaining relationships, which increased the loneliness, which increased the drinking. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Bukowski was aware of this cycle but did not struggle against it. He accepted it as the shape his life had taken. Fighting it would have required changes he was not willing to make. Sobriety, regular social contact, opening himself up to people. All of this seemed worse than continuing as he was. His writing about solitude captured something that many people recognize but rarely admit. Sometimes being alone is not just acceptable but actively preferable. The world is exhausting. Other people are demanding. Their needs and opinions and expectations create pressure. Removing yourself from all of that creates a kind of peace, even if that peace includes loneliness. The reader responds to Bukowski's portrayal of solitude divided along clear lines. People who were themselves socially isolated found his work validating. He was saying that you did not have to apologize for being alone, that it was possible to build a life around solitude, that the mainstream pressure to be constantly social was not the only way to exist. Other readers found his isolation sad, evidence of damage, something that should be fixed rather than accepted. In his final years, after marrying Linda, Bukowski's isolation decreased substantially. He lived with another person, had regular social contact, participated in something resembling a conventional domestic life. This change did not come from deciding that his previous isolation had been a mistake. It came from finding someone who understood his need for solitude and did not demand more interaction than he could provide. The marriage worked partly because Linda gave him space. He had areas of the house that were his alone. He could withdraw when he needed to. The relationship did not eliminate his fundamental preference for solitude, but it provided companionship without overwhelming him. This balance had not been available in his earlier relationships, where partners had wanted more intimacy than he could sustain. Even while married, Bukowski maintained patterns of withdrawal. He spent hours alone in his writing room. He took drives by himself. He protected his solitude within the relationship, and Linda respected those boundaries. The accommodation made the relationship sustainable in a way his earlier attempts at partnership had not been. Looking at Bukowski's life as a whole, the loneliness appears as a consistent choice rather than an unfortunate circumstance. He could have been less alone. He had opportunities for friendship and community. He rejected these opportunities because the cost of accepting them was too high. He valued his independence and his writing more than he valued connection, and he structured his life accordingly. Whether this was admirable or sad depends on your own values. If you believe that human connection is essential to a meaningful life, then Bukowski's isolation looks like a failure. If you believe that people have the right to organize their lives around their own priorities, even when those priorities are unconventional, then his isolation looks like a coherent choice. Bukowski himself did not ask for approval or sympathy regarding his loneliness. He lived alone because that was how he preferred to live. The racetrack gospel, gambling, and fate. Bukowski discovered horse racing in his 30s and remained devoted to it for the rest of his life. He went to the track regularly, studied racing forms, placed bets, won sometimes, and lost more often. This was not casual entertainment. It was a practice that provided structure to his days and a framework for understanding how the world operated. Hollywood Park was his usual track, located in Inglewood, not far from where he lived. The facility had sections for different types of patrons. The wealthy sat in the clubhouse with table service. Serious gamblers occupied the grandstand, standing near the rail or sitting in specific spots they claimed as their territory. Bukowski belonged to this second group, the men who came alone and spent hours analyzing past performances. The attraction was not primarily about money, though he needed to win when possible. The track offered something more fundamental. It was a system where outcomes were determined by complex factors, some measurable and some not. You could study the data, apply logic, make informed decisions. Then the race would happen, and your analysis would prove correct or incorrect. The feedback was immediate and absolute. Handicapping a race required examining multiple variables. Each horse's past performance, the jockey, the trainer, the track conditions, the distance, the competition. You looked for patterns, tried to identify which horses were improving or declining, which trainers were hot, which jockeys performed well under specific conditions. The work was analytical, almost mathematical. But analysis could only take you so far. Horses were animals, unpredictable in crucial ways. A horse that had run well for months might suddenly quit. Another might break from the gate poorly and ruin its chances regardless of ability. Accidents happened. Jockeys made mistakes. The favorite often lost. No amount of preparation guaranteed success. This combination of skill and chance matched Bukowski's understanding of life. You could be smart, work hard, make good decisions, and still lose. Circumstances beyond your control determined much of what happened. The track made this reality visible in a way that most of life did not. You placed your bet, the race happened, you won or lost. The randomness was undeniable. Bukowski wrote about the track constantly. Short stories set there, poems describing specific races, essays about the experience of betting and losing. The track appeared as a location where people revealed themselves in ways they did not in normal social situations. Under the pressure of gambling, you saw who could handle loss and who could not, who understood probability and who believed in luck or destiny. The other gamblers were part of the attraction, men who had been coming to the track for decades, who had systems and theories, who sometimes won big and more often lost slowly. They were recognizable types. The desperate man betting money he could not afford to lose, trying to recover from previous losses. The professional who treated gambling as a job, managing his bankroll carefully. The deluded man convinced his system would eventually pay off despite years of evidence to the contrary. Bukowski saw himself in all of these types. He knew he was not a professional, that his betting was not disciplined enough to be truly profitable over time. But he also knew he understood the game better than the fools who bet based on horse names or jockey silks. He occupied a middle position, competent but not expert, engaged but not destroyed by losses. The social aspect of the track was different from bars or other gathering places. Men stood together watching races but did not necessarily talk. When they did talk, it was about horses and handicapping, not about personal matters. You could be around people without having to perform socially. The shared focus was the racing, and that focus provided enough connection without requiring intimacy. Women rarely appeared in Bukowski's track writing except as occasional companions who did not understand what they were seeing. The track was male space, and the masculine culture there was based on stoic acceptance of loss. You did not complain about bad beats or unlucky breaks. You accepted the outcome, studied the next race, made another bet. Emotional displays were embarrassing. The track also provided escape from time pressure. Race days lasted hours. You could arrive when the gates opened and stay until the final race. Nothing else had to happen. The post office job, relationship problems, unpaid bills, all of it disappeared while you were at the track. The only thing that mattered was the next race. Bukowski's betting was usually small, $2 or $5 or $10 per race. He was not a high roller. The small bets meant he could stay in action all day without going broke in the first few races. This was important. The point was not to win a lot on a single race, but to remain engaged with the entire card, to have money and play continuously. When he did win, particularly on long shots, the satisfaction came not from the money, but from being right when the crowd was wrong. The favorite would lose, the horse he had backed would come in, and his judgment was validated. The crowd had missed something he had seen. This feeling justified all the losses, at least temporarily. The losses were constant and inevitable. Anyone who gambles regularly loses more often than they win. The track takes a percentage of every bet, so even if you handicap perfectly, you are fighting against the house edge. Bukowski understood this intellectually, but continued betting anyway, because the activity itself was valuable regardless of financial outcome. His relationship with fate and randomness was complex. He did not believe in destiny or that things happen for a reason. Events occurred through combination of factors, some predictable and many not. But he also did not believe that human control extended very far. You made your choices and then discovered what happened. The track demonstrated this principle in concentrated form. Many of Bukowski's poems used racing metaphors to describe life. People were compared to horses, some with natural ability that was never developed, others with less talent who succeeded through determination or luck. The race itself stood in for any competitive situation where you tried and either succeeded or failed. The metaphor worked because racing was fundamentally honest. The result was visible and undeniable. As he aged and achieved financial success, Bukowski's relationship with the track changed slightly. He could afford to lose more, though he still bet modestly. The necessity that had once driven his gambling was gone. He went to the track because he enjoyed it, because it remained one of the few activities that fully engaged his attention. The track also provided material for writing. He could spend an afternoon there, observing the people and the races, and return home with enough observations for several poems. The environment was rich with detail, and the emotional landscape of gambling provided endless variations on themes of hope and disappointment. In his final years, health problems made going to the track more difficult. He watched races on television instead, betting by phone. This was not the same as being present, but it maintained his connection to the activity. Even when dying of leukemia, he followed the horses, placed bets, engaged with the randomness and the analysis. The track represented something essential about Bukowski's worldview. Life was not fair. Outcomes were not proportional to effort or merit. Randomness played a larger role than people wanted to admit. You could study and prepare and still lose. The appropriate response was not to stop participating, but to continue with clear eyes, accepting that loss was more common than victory, but that the activity itself had value independent of results. Rejection as fuel, the power of not fitting in. Before Bukowski achieved any recognition, he accumulated rejection on a scale that would have stopped most people from continuing. He submitted stories and poems to magazines for years during his 20s and early 30s. The responses were consistent. Not interested, not right for us. Too crude, too depressing, too focused on unsavory subjects. He kept the rejection slips, hundreds of them, from literary magazines and commercial publications and everything in between. Each one represented the judgment of an editor who had looked at his work and decided it was not good enough or not appropriate or not what they wanted. The cumulative message was clear. The literary establishment did not want what he was producing. Most writers faced with this level of rejection would have drawn one of two conclusions. Either the work was genuinely bad and needed to be changed to meet editorial expectations, or writing was not a viable path and should be abandoned for something more realistic. Bukowski drew a different conclusion. The editors were wrong and their standards were corrupt. This was not defensive rationalization. He had read the magazines that rejected him. He knew what they published. The work was polished and safe, following established conventions, avoiding anything too disturbing or raw. It was literature designed not to offend anyone, to fit comfortably within existing categories. His work violated these expectations deliberately, and the rejections proved he was succeeding in the violation. The experience of sustained rejection shaped his relationship with the literary world permanently. He never sought approval from establishment institutions. He never tried to moderate his work to make it more acceptable. The rejection confirmed that he was outside the system, and being outside the system was where he wanted to be. During the period when he stopped writing, roughly his early to mid-30s, the rejection had achieved its goal if the goal was to silence him. He had tried to enter the literary world through conventional channels and been turned away repeatedly. He accepted the verdict and walked away. But the silence was temporary. When he returned to writing, it was with a different orientation. He was no longer trying to get accepted. He was simply producing work, and if anyone wanted to publish it, fine. If not, he would keep producing it anyway. The small underground magazines that eventually published him had their own form of credibility, one based not on commercial success or critical approval, but on authenticity and willingness to take risks. Publishing in these magazines marked him as part of the counterculture, the literary underground that existed parallel to the mainstream. This position suited him perfectly. He had never wanted to be mainstream anyway. The early readers who discovered his work in these small magazines had often experienced their own forms of rejection. They were not part of literary culture, did not attend university, worked regular jobs, or drifted without stable employment. They recognized in Bukowski's writing something that spoke to their own experience of being excluded or dismissed. His success came from appealing to people the mainstream ignored. As his reputation grew within underground circles, he began receiving different kinds of rejection, not from editors who considered his work unpublishable, but from critics who dismissed it as crude or immature or as merely therapeutic venting rather than serious literature. These rejections bothered him less than the early ones had, because by this point he had an audience and knew his work connected with readers. The academic establishment never embraced Bukowski. Universities did not teach his work, scholars did not write serious critical studies of it, he was not invited to give readings at prestigious venues. This exclusion was mutual. He had no respect for academic literary criticism, which he saw as deliberately obscure and disconnected from actual reading experience. Academics returned the favor by treating him as a popular phenomenon rather than a serious artist. This suited him. Academic approval would have complicated his stance as an outsider. If universities had started teaching his work, he would have become part of the establishment he rejected. The continued exclusion allowed him to maintain his position as an alternative voice, someone who succeeded despite the gatekeepers rather than through them. European acceptance came before American acceptance. German publishers in particular embraced his work, translating it and promoting it to large audiences. In Germany, Bukowski became a major literary figure while remaining relatively unknown in the United States outside of underground circles. The geographic and cultural distance made the European success less threatening to his identity as an outsider. When American mainstream success finally arrived in his 60s, it came with complications. Suddenly he was being published by major houses, reviewed in major newspapers, earning substantial money. The same establishment that had rejected him for decades now wanted to claim him. Publishers who had previously shown no interest were competing for his work. Bukowski's response was to take the money while maintaining his contempt for the system. He signed contracts with commercial publishers but did not change his writing to suit their preferences. He gave interviews where he insulted the literary establishment even while benefiting from their attention. He understood that the mainstream's interest in him was partly fashion, that he had become acceptable precisely because he represented something that seemed authentic in contrast to conventional literature. The late success validated his earlier decision to continue despite rejection. He had been right. The editors who rejected him had been wrong, or at least had been measuring his work against irrelevant standards. But the validation came too late to change his fundamental orientation. He had spent too many years outside to suddenly become an insider, even when offered the position. Younger writers sometimes approached him asking for advice about dealing with rejection. His response was consistent. If rejection stops you from writing, you are not a real writer anyway. Real writers write because they have to, regardless of whether anyone publishes the work or pays for it. Rejection is just information about the current state of publishing, not information about the value of your work. This attitude was both inspiring and problematic. Inspiring because it encouraged writers to persist despite discouragement. Problematic because it ignored the real economic and psychological costs of sustained rejection. Bukowski could afford to be indifferent to rejection, partly because he had other income, limited financial needs, and a personality that converted rejection into motivation rather than despair. The power he derived from not fitting in was real but came at a cost. He lived in poverty for decades. He worked a job he hated. He had no security and no safety net. The position outside the system was authentic, but it was also precarious. Most people cannot afford that degree of precariousness, which is why most people compromise in ways Bukowski refused to compromise. His example is often cited by people advocating for artistic integrity and resistance to commercial pressure. But the example only works if you are willing to accept everything that came with it. The drinking, the poverty, the isolation, the decades of obscurity. Bukowski did not experience these as noble sacrifices. He experienced them as necessary consequences of the choices he made. The rejection never stopped bothering him entirely. Even after achieving success, he remained sensitive to criticism and dismissal. He wrote angry responses to negative reviews, engaged in feuds with critics, maintained grudges against editors who had rejected him decades earlier. The outsider position was his identity, but it was also a wound that never fully healed. What the rejection taught him was that the gatekeepers were not reliable judges of value. They had their own interests, their own aesthetics, their own commercial pressures. Their approval or disapproval said more about them than about the work they were evaluating. This understanding freed him to trust his own judgment, to write what seemed true to him regardless of external validation. The lesson applies beyond literature. In any field, the people in positions to grant or withhold approval have agendas that may not align with quality or truth. Being rejected by them might mean your work is bad, or it might mean your work threatens their interests or violates their conventions. The rejection itself does not tell you which is the case. You have to decide for yourself whether to change your work to gain acceptance or to continue without it. Bukowski chose to continue without it, and eventually the acceptance came anyway. But it came on his terms, after he had already established his identity as someone outside the system. The success did not require him to apologize for the work that had been rejected or to moderate his approach. It required only that cultural tastes shifted enough that what had seemed unacceptable became interesting. Boredom, routine, and the small deaths of daily life. Existence under capitalism for most people consists primarily of repetition. You wake at the same time, travel to work by the same route, perform the same tasks, return home, sleep, repeat. The days are structurally identical. Variation occurs only at the margins, small differences that do not change the fundamental pattern. This routine continues for decades, interrupted briefly by weekends and vacations that themselves become routine. Bukowski recognized this repetition as a form of death. Not the final cessation of life, but an ongoing process of dying, where each identical day erased a portion of your vitality and consciousness. You became less alive without technically dying. The routine killed you slowly enough that you could adjust to the diminishment, could learn to live as a reduced version of yourself. The post office exemplified this process. Each day required the same actions performed in the same order. Sort mail, help customers, fill out forms, take regulated breaks. The work was designed to be mindless, to require no creativity or independent thought. You were a component in a system, performing your function exactly as specified. The fact that you were human, with a mind and personality and unique perspective, was irrelevant to the role. After weeks of this work, the sameness became oppressive. After months, it became normalized. After years, it became your life. You stopped noticing the sameness because noticing was painful and accomplished nothing. You developed habits and mental strategies to make the time pass. You thought about other things while performing tasks. You counted hours until your shift ended. You looked forward to days off that were themselves often boring. Bukowski saw his co-workers adapt to this routine in different ways. Some found small satisfactions in doing their work efficiently or in helping customers solve problems. They had made peace with the job by finding meaning within its narrow boundaries. Others were visibly miserable but showed up anyway, day after day, because they needed the paycheck and saw no alternatives. Both groups were dying, just at different rates and with different levels of awareness. The existential problem was that the routine consumed the majority of your time. If you worked 8 hours and slept 8 hours, that left 8 hours for everything else. But those 8 hours included commuting, eating, basic maintenance of your body, and living space. The time truly available for activities you chose was small, and you usually lacked energy to use it well because the work had exhausted you. Bukowski's solution was alcohol. Drinking created variation in consciousness, made the evenings different from the work hours, provided a sense of escape, even though you were just sitting alone in a room. The alcohol was not solving the problem of boring routine. It was making the problem tolerable by numbing you to it. This was self-medication, treating an environmental problem with a chemical solution. Writing served a similar function but with different consequences. When he wrote, Bukowski was engaged in an activity that was not routine, that required attention and produced something. The writing was his, not something imposed by an employer. Even if no one ever read it, the act of creation was different from the act of sorting mail. It was the opposite of the small death occurring at work. The routine extended beyond employment. Relationships fell into patterns. The same arguments repeated. Sex became mechanical. Conversations covered familiar ground. Even rebellion and resistance, if repeated often enough, became routine. You could live as an outsider in the same repetitive way other people lived as insiders. Bukowski wrote about boredom without trying to overcome it or find redemption in it. The work simply recorded the experience. A hangover described in detail, an evening spent staring at a wall, the specific quality of tedium during a slow shift at work. These descriptions were not meant to be uplifting. They were meant to be accurate. Many readers found this focus on boredom itself boring. They wanted drama or insight or some payoff for the attention they invested. Bukowski provided none of that. The boredom in the writing mirrored the boredom it described. This was deliberate. He was not going to make meaninglessness seem meaningful through literary technique. The small deaths accumulated. Each repetitive day slightly reduced your capacity to feel or think intensely. Over time, you became habituated to low-level existence. The extraordinary became threatening rather than appealing because it disrupted the routine you had adapted to. You chose safety and predictability even though those choices were killing you. Weekends offered the possibility of variation, but most people used weekends to recover from work rather than to live differently. You slept late, did chores, maybe drank or watched television. Monday arrived and the routine resumed. The weekend had provided a pause, not an alternative. Bukowski understood that the routine was not accidental. It was how the system maintained itself. If people had enough time and energy to imagine alternatives, they might pursue those alternatives. Keeping them exhausted and trapped in repetition prevented that possibility. The routine was a control mechanism disguised as normal adult life. Breaking free from routine required either dramatic action or acceptance of insecurity. Dramatic action might mean quitting your job, ending a relationship, moving to a new city. These actions created immediate crisis, forced you to deal with uncertainty and risk. Most people avoided such disruption because the temporary relief of the routine, however deadening, felt safer than chaos. Bukowski's eventual escape from the post office was dramatic action. He quit with minimal savings and no guarantee of income. The first months were difficult financially, but the relief of not having to report to the terminal annex, not having to perform the same tasks, not having to submit to supervision, this relief was immense. He was poor, but not dying the slow death anymore. The writing routine he established after quitting was itself repetitive. He sat at his typewriter each day, produced pages, drank while working. But this routine was self-imposed rather than externally mandated. The difference mattered. He controlled the schedule, the method, the content. The repetition came from his own decision to work consistently rather than from an employer's demands. Even after achieving success and financial security, Bukowski maintained an awareness of how most people lived, trapped in routines that slowly killed them. His later work continued to reference the post office and other forms of meaningless employment. He had escaped but did not forget. The memory of those years informed his understanding that most lives were structured around slow death. The small deaths were not metaphorical. They were actual losses of capacity and aliveness. Each day spent in routine was a day not spent experiencing something new or creating something or engaging deeply with existence. Those days did not return. You got older, used up more of your limited time, approached actual death having spent most of your life in a state that resembled death already. Bukowski's response was not to offer solutions. He did not advocate for specific political changes or personal transformations. He simply described what he saw, trusting that readers would recognize the truth of it. Many did recognize it, found in his work validation of their own sense that something was fundamentally wrong with how life was organized. The question his work posed was whether awareness of the problem changed anything. If you understood that routine was killing you but remained trapped in it by economic necessity, what did the understanding accomplish? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps awareness just made the situation more painful. Or perhaps awareness was the first requirement for any change, even if change itself remained unlikely. The Tyranny of Ambition. Why Bukowski Distrusted Success. Ambition is treated as a virtue in American culture. People are supposed to want more, to strive for advancement, to set goals and work toward achievement. The ambitious person is admirable. The person without ambition is lazy or unmotivated or wasting their potential. This framework assumes that striving for success is natural and healthy. Bukowski rejected this entirely. He saw ambition as a trap that destroyed more than it created. The ambitious person was never satisfied with what they had. They were always reaching for the next level, the next promotion, the next achievement. This constant reaching meant they never actually experienced contentment. Success was always ahead, never present. Literary ambition was particularly corrupt. Writers who wanted to be famous or respected or included in important anthologies shaped their work to meet the expectations of critics and gatekeepers. They wrote what they thought would be praised rather than what they actually needed to write. The ambition corrupted the work at its source. Bukowski had seen this corruption firsthand. In the underground literary scene, some writers were genuinely trying to express something. Others were positioning themselves, trying to build reputations that could later be converted into academic positions or commercial success. The difference was obvious in the work. The ambitious writing felt calculated, designed to impress rather than to communicate. The problem with ambition was that it required you to care what others thought. Your success was measured by external validation, awards and sales and critical recognition. This meant giving power to people whose opinions were often worthless. A critic who had never written a decent line could destroy your reputation. A publisher motivated purely by profit could determine whether your work reached readers. Caring about these people's judgments meant subordinating your own. Bukowski's lack of ambition was not laziness. He worked constantly, producing an enormous volume of writing over his lifetime. But he was not working toward a goal like winning the National Book Award or getting a teaching position at a university. He was working because the writing itself was what mattered. The external rewards were irrelevant at best and corrupting at worst. This attitude insulated him from certain disappointments. When critics dismissed his work, he did not care because he had not been writing for critics. When he was excluded from prestigious anthologies, it did not matter because he had not been trying to get included. The lack of ambition meant the rejections had no power over him. Career-minded writers planned their publications strategically, built relationships with influential people, attended important events. This was treated as professionalism, as taking your work seriously. Bukowski saw it as prostitution. You were selling not just your work but yourself, performing whatever roles would advance your career. The performance became more important than the work. He noticed that successful writers often became less interesting after achieving success. Their early work, produced when they were unknown and had nothing to lose, was vital and honest. The later work, produced after they had reputations to protect, was careful and safe. Success had made them worse writers by giving them something to lose. The tyranny of ambition extended beyond individual corruption. It shaped the entire literary culture. Publishers wanted books that would sell. Critics wanted work that fit existing categories and confirmed their theoretical frameworks. Awards committees wanted safe choices that would not generate controversy. The system selected for mediocrity disguised as excellence. Ambitious writers adapted to these pressures. They wrote novels structured according to MFA workshop conventions. They avoided topics or styles that might alienate influential readers. They cultivated the right tone, serious but not too challenging, literary but accessible. The result was a literary culture full of competent, forgettable work produced by writers who had successfully navigated institutional demands. Bukowski's success, when it came, was suspect precisely because he had not pursued it. He had spent decades writing what he wanted without regard for marketability. The work had found an audience despite the literary establishment, not through it. When mainstream publishers finally became interested, it was because his audience had grown large enough to ignore, not because gatekeepers had decided he was worthy. This created a paradox. Success made his life easier financially, but threatened the outsider position that defined him. He was no longer a struggling writer working a shit job. He was a commercially successful author with a nice house. The authenticity that had made his work compelling could be questioned. Had success corrupted him the way he always said it corrupted others? Bukowski's response was to keep writing the same way. He did not change his subject matter or his style to appeal to his new, larger audience. He did not moderate the crudeness or start writing about topics considered more appropriate for a successful author. The work remained focused on drinking, sex, racing, the same obsessions he had always written about. But something had changed. The desperation was gone. Early Bukowski wrote from a position of genuine poverty and failure. Late Bukowski wrote from a position of comfort and recognition. The voice remained similar, but the circumstances had shifted. Critics who wanted to dismiss him pointed to this shift as evidence that his entire stance had been performance. The accusation had some validity. A wealthy man writing about poverty is in a different position than a poor man writing about poverty. Bukowski was still writing about his past experiences, but he was writing from a present that was very different. The question was whether this mattered, whether authenticity required ongoing suffering. Bukowski argued that it did not matter. He had lived through the poverty and the failure. Those experiences were real, and writing about them remained valid regardless of his current circumstances. He had not betrayed anything by accepting money for his work. He had simply continued doing what he always did, while the external circumstances changed around him. The defense was not entirely convincing. There was something different about the later work, a loss of edge that came from no longer having everything at risk. The early work was written by someone who had nothing and nothing to lose. The late work was written by someone protecting a comfortable life. The desperation that had driven the early work was absent. Ambition, in Bukowski's analysis, was mostly about ego. People wanted to be recognized as important, to have their value confirmed by external authorities. They needed to be told they mattered. This need made them vulnerable to manipulation and control. If you did not care about recognition, you could not be controlled through granting or withholding it. He saw ambitious people as fundamentally insecure. Confident people did not need constant validation from others. They knew what they were doing and why, and other people's opinions were just noise. Ambitious people required the validation because they were not internally certain of their own worth. The literary world was full of these insecure people competing for limited recognition. There were only so many awards, so many spots in prestigious magazines, so many faculty positions. Competition was fierce and often petty. Writers developed rivalries, formed cliques, engaged in political maneuvering. All of this was the result of treating success as scarce resource rather than internal state. Bukowski removed himself from this competition by refusing to compete. He did not want what the others wanted. This meant they could not use the standard methods of control on him. Threatening to exclude him from opportunities he did not care about had no effect. Offering him inclusion in exchange for compliance did not work because he did not value inclusion. This independence came at a cost. He remained marginal for decades when greater strategic thinking might have brought earlier success. He alienated people who could have helped him. He made enemies unnecessarily through his refusal to play social games. The lack of ambition was authentic but also inefficient if the goal was conventional success. But conventional success was not the goal. The goal was to write honestly without compromise. By that measure, his approach worked. He produced a large body of work that maintained consistent voice and vision across decades. Writers who had been more ambitious often produced work that shifted based on market trends or critical fashion. Their careers might have been more successful, but their work was less coherent. In his final years, Bukowski was widely recognized and financially secure. The success had arrived despite his lack of ambition. Some saw this as vindication of his approach. Others saw it as luck or timing. He had happened to write in a style that eventually became fashionable. If taste had not shifted, he would have remained obscure. Both interpretations had validity. Bukowski's success was partly about quality. His work was genuinely compelling to many readers. But it was also about cultural changes that made his style and subject matter more acceptable. In a different era, he might never have found an audience. The lack of ambition did not guarantee success. It just meant that when success came, it came on his terms. The lesson was not that ambition was always bad. Some people genuinely want conventional success and should pursue it. The lesson was that ambition required trade-offs, and those trade-offs needed to be conscious. If you wanted literary fame, you had to accept that the pursuit would shape your work in specific ways. If you were not willing to accept that shaping, you needed to abandon the ambition, not pretend you could have both integrity and conventional success without compromise. Death, dying, and not giving a damn. Bukowski lived with death as a constant awareness. He drank heavily enough that medical professionals told him repeatedly he was killing himself. He developed health problems in his 30s that should have stopped him but did not. He watched friends and lovers die, sometimes from the same behaviors he engaged in. Death was not abstract or distant. It was present, always available, waiting. His response was not fear or denial, but a kind of indifference that looked like courage but might have been something else. He continued drinking despite the warnings. He did not change his lifestyle when doctors told him it was unsustainable. The implication was that he did not care enough about survival to modify his behavior, or that survival at the cost of changing who he was seemed worse than death. This attitude appeared in his writing as early as his 20s. Stories and poems that treated death casually, not as tragedy but as ordinary occurrence. People died, often badly, and life continued. There was no suggestion that death was meaningful, or that it taught lessons, or that it should be prevented at all costs. Death was simply what happened eventually to everyone. The bleeding ulcer at 35 brought him close enough to death that he understood it physically. The hospital stay, the genuine possibility of not surviving, the decision to drink again afterward knowing it might kill him. This was not suicidal in the clinical sense. He was not trying to die, but he was willing to risk death rather than give up the drinking, which amounted to choosing a certain kind of life over the guarantee of longer survival. Jane's death affected him more than he expected. They had separated before she died, and the relationship had been destructive for both of them. But her death was final in a way their separations had not been. The possibility of reconnecting, which had always existed when she was alive, disappeared. He wrote about her for years afterward, the dead woman becoming more present in his work than she had been in life. Other deaths followed. Writers he knew from the underground scene, people he had corresponded with, drunks from the bars he frequented. The mortality rate among people living as he lived was high. Alcohol and poverty and lack of medical care combined to kill people young. Bukowski survived when many did not, less through caution than through constitution. His body tolerated the abuse longer than others' bodies did. He wrote about death without sentimentality. The dying person was not granted sudden wisdom or dignity. Death was usually ugly and painful and stupid. People died badly, their bodies failing in unpleasant ways. Nothing noble or meaningful about the process. This was closer to actual experience than the romantic death scenes in conventional literature. Aging brought its own confrontation with mortality. Bukowski lived long enough to experience his body deteriorating in ways that could not be blamed entirely on drinking. He wrote about getting old, the loss of physical capacity, the awareness that time was running out. The writing maintained its tone, observational rather than self-pitying, but the subject was different from the earlier work about being young and destroying yourself. By his 60s, after achieving success and marrying Linda, death was no longer something he seemed to be courting. He had reasons to live that had not existed during the desperate years. The work was going well. He had a stable home life. Money removed immediate pressures. Death was still coming, but he was no longer rushing toward it. The leukemia diagnosis came when he was 73. Cancer, not liver failure or some other alcohol-related disease. Though the decades of drinking had certainly damaged his body, the diagnosis was terminal. Treatment might extend his life somewhat, but would not cure him. He was going to die, probably within a year or two. His response was characteristic. He continued writing. He did not become philosophical or reflective in new ways. He did not make peace with people he had feuded with or try to settle accounts. He kept working, producing poems and stories until he was too sick to sit at the typewriter. The dying did not transform him or teach him things he had not already known. He died on March 9th, 1994, at home in San Pedro. Linda was with him. He was 73 years old, older than many people with his habits managed to reach. His last words, according to witnesses, were variations on his usual themes, observations about the absurdity of existence and the inevitability of this outcome. His gravestone was marked with the phrase, "Don't try," an epitaph that summarized his philosophy about writing and living. Do not force things. Do not strain for effects. Let it happen naturally, or do not let it happen at all. The phrase applied to death as much as to anything else. Do not fight it desperately. Accept it as part of the process. The question his life posed about death was whether his indifference was admirable or pathological. Was he brave in facing mortality without fear, Or was he damaged in ways that prevented him from valuing his own survival? The answer probably depends on your own values and fears. What is clear is that Bukowski did not allow fear of death to control his choices. He lived as he wanted even when that way of living shortened his life. Whether this was wisdom or self-destruction, it was at least consistent. He did not spend his final years regretting his earlier choices or wishing he had lived differently. Many people become more conservative as they age, more focused on health and longevity, more afraid of death as it approaches. Bukowski moved in the opposite direction. His early work showed more anxiety about death than his later work. By the end, he seemed genuinely indifferent, not because he had overcome fear through philosophy, but because he had exhausted his capacity for caring about outcomes he could not control. The work produced during his final years maintained quality despite his declining health. The voice remained consistent, the observations sharp, the honesty intact. Death was approaching, but did not get special treatment in the writing. It was just another thing happening, worth noting, but not worth dwelling on. His influence on how subsequent writers approached death was significant. The honesty about mortality, the refusal to make it meaningful or redemptive, the insistence on describing the physical reality of dying bodies, this became an available mode for writers who rejected conventional treatments of death. Not everyone adopted this mode, but it existed as an option partly because Bukowski had demonstrated it. The legacy question was complicated by his death. He had lived to see his work widely recognized and had died before that recognition faded or turned into something else. The timing was almost ideal from the perspective of reputation. He did not live long enough to become a parody of himself or to produce enough weak late work to damage the earlier achievements. Death ended his life but did not end the work's life. The books remained, finding new readers who had not been born when he was writing them. The influence continued spreading. In this sense, death had failed to stop him, though he would have found that notion sentimental and probably false. The work continued because culture had mechanisms for preserving and distributing it, not because death could be defeated through art. Fame came late, success when you stop wanting it. For most of his life, Bukowski was unknown outside small circles of underground literature enthusiasts. He published in magazines no one read, released books in editions of a few hundred copies, gave readings to audiences of 10 or 20 people. This obscurity lasted into his 50s. By conventional measures, he had failed as a writer despite decades of work. The obscurity was not chosen initially. In his 20s and 30s, he had submitted work to mainstream magazines and been rejected consistently. He would have accepted success if it had been offered. But after enough rejection, after enough years of producing work that no one wanted to publish through normal channels, the obscurity became something else. It became his natural position, the place from which he wrote. The underground literary scene that embraced him in his 40s consisted of small press publishers, mimeographed magazines, mail-order distribution. No money changed hands, or very little. Editors were enthusiasts working other jobs to support their publishing activities. The readership was tiny but dedicated. These people sought out difficult or challenging work that commercial publishers avoided. Bukowski fit perfectly into this world. His work was too raw for commercial publication but ideal for readers who wanted something unfiltered. The small press publishers had no commercial pressures, no need to appeal to mass audiences or avoid controversy. They could publish exactly what they wanted, and what they wanted was work like Bukowski's. Through the 1960s and early 1970s, his reputation grew slowly within this underground network. People who read one Bukowski poem would seek out more. Small press publishers competed to release his collections. His readings, when he gave them, attracted increasingly large audiences of people who felt excluded from mainstream literary culture. The audience was primarily young men, working class or drifting, many with drinking problems or difficulty maintaining conventional lives. They recognized themselves in Bukowski's work. He was writing about experiences they had, in language they understood, without the condescension or romanticism that characterized most literature about poverty and failure. European interest developed before American mainstream interest. German publishers translated his work in the early 1970s, and he developed a substantial following there. The German audience seemed to appreciate his directness and his refusal to provide moral comfort. He became more famous in Germany than in his own country, which he found amusing and appropriate. By his mid-50s, Bukowski was supporting himself through writing, barely. Small press royalties, payment for poems and stories, occasional reading fees. The income was unstable but sufficient for his minimal needs. He lived cheaply, drank cheap wine, drove an old car. The lifestyle had not changed from his working years, except that he no longer had to go to the post office. The breakthrough came with the publication of his novels in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Post Office in 1971, Factotum in 1975, Women in 1978, Ham on Rye in 1982. These were published by Black Sparrow Press, still a small operation but with better distribution than his previous publishers. The novels reached readers who had not encountered his poetry or short stories. The novels were thinly disguised autobiography, documenting his experiences at the post office, his years of drifting and temporary employment, his relationships with women, his childhood. They were structured loosely, more like connected episodes than traditional narratives. Critics who valued conventional novel construction dismissed them. Readers who valued honesty embraced them. Women in particular became popular, probably because it combined sex and relationships with Bukowski's characteristic bluntness. The novel described his experiences with numerous women during the period after he quit the post office. The sex was explicit, and the portrayals were unflattering, both of the women and of himself. The book sold better than anything he had previously published. By 1980, at age 60, Bukowski was no longer obscure. His book sold thousands of copies. Major newspapers reviewed his work. Universities invited him to read. Publishers who had previously ignored him now wanted to sign him. The transformation from underground figure to recognized author happened relatively quickly once it started. The late success created complications. He had defined himself as an outsider, someone rejected by the mainstream. Now the mainstream was accepting him, publishing his work, paying him substantial advances. The outsider position was threatened by inclusion. He could no longer claim to be ignored when magazines were interviewing him and bookstores were stocking his titles. His response was to accept the money while maintaining his contempt for the institutions providing it. He signed contracts with commercial publishers but insulted them in interviews. He accepted invitations to read at universities but showed up drunk and hostile. He took the mainstream's money without granting them legitimacy or respect. This attitude was partly genuine and partly performance. The contempt was real. He did think mainstream literary culture was corrupt and stupid, but he also understood that his role as hostile outsider was part of his appeal. The audience wanted him to be authentic, to refuse to be domesticated by success. Maintaining the persona was both honest expression and strategic choice. The screenplay for Barfly, released in 1987, brought him to wider attention. The film, starring Mickey Rourke as a character based on Bukowski, introduced him to people who had never read his work. Suddenly, he was not just a cult figure but someone recognizable in broader culture. This level of fame was uncomfortable and unwanted. He gave interviews reluctantly, usually while drinking, saying things designed to offend or provoke. The interviews became performances, Bukowski playing the role of Bukowski for journalists who wanted the crude drunk they had read about. Some of this was genuine, some was him giving them what they expected. The distinction became unclear. The late success meant he finally had money. He bought a house in San Pedro, a nice neighborhood, far from the cheap apartments he had lived in for decades. He drove a better car. He could afford good wine instead of cheap wine. The material circumstances of his life improved dramatically, which raised questions about whether he could still write authentically about poverty and failure. His solution was to continue writing about the past. The late work mined his earlier experiences, describing the post office years and the poverty and the failed relationships from the perspective of someone who had escaped those circumstances. The work was still honest about what those experiences had been like, even though he was no longer living them. Some critics and readers felt the late work lacked the urgency of the early work. The desperation was gone, replaced by reminiscence. The man writing in a comfortable house about being broke 30 years earlier was in a different position than the broke man writing about current poverty. The difference showed in the work. Bukowski acknowledged this but did not apologize for it. He had earned the comfort through decades of work. He had paid his dues. If success made him less interesting as a writer, that was acceptable trade-off. He was not going to reject money or pretend to still be poor in order to maintain artistic credibility. The late fame also brought imitators. Younger writers adopted his style, the short lines and crude language, and focus on drinking and sex. Most of the imitations were unsuccessful because they copied the surface elements without understanding what made the original work compelling. Bukowski's honesty could not be imitated, only the mannerisms. He was dismissive of his imitators, but also somewhat responsible for them. By demonstrating that you could write simply and directly about low-life experience and find an audience, he had opened that path for others. Many followed it badly. But some produced genuine work that extended his approach in new directions. By his late 60s, Bukowski was internationally famous within literary culture and recognized more broadly as a cultural figure. He had achieved the success that had eluded him for most of his life. The achievement came too late to change his fundamental orientation. He had formed his identity during the years of obscurity and failure, and late recognition did not erase or replace that formation. The timing was both fortunate and unfortunate. Fortunate because he lived to see his work recognized and was able to enjoy the financial security. Unfortunate because the recognition came when he was too old and set in his ways to fully adapt to it. A younger man might have used the success as foundation for something new. Bukowski just continued doing what he had always done, now with a larger audience and better payment. The question his late success raised was whether the decades of obscurity had been necessary. Would he have been a better writer if he had achieved success earlier, or did the failure and poverty create the voice that eventually found an audience? The question is unanswerable, but the pattern suggests that the suffering was not wasted. It provided the material and the perspective that made the work valuable. The Bluebird, vulnerability behind the tough guy mask. Bukowski cultivated an image of hardness. The drunk who did not care, the cynic who expected nothing from people, the tough guy who could take whatever life delivered without complaint. This persona dominated his public presence and most of his writing. He was crude, confrontational, emotionally distant. The mask was convincing because it was partly real, but underneath the performance was something else. A poem called Bluebird revealed it more clearly than anything else he wrote. The poem described a bluebird living in his chest, a delicate thing that wanted to come out. He kept it hidden, showed it only to his wife late at night when no one else could see. During the day, he poured whiskey on the bird to keep it quiet, to prevent it from emerging and embarrassing him. The bluebird represented the vulnerability and tenderness he could not afford to show publicly. To survive as he had survived, to work the jobs he worked, to navigate the bars and the streets and the failures required toughness. Showing weakness invited exploitation. Showing emotion invited mockery. The protective shell was necessary, or felt necessary, which produced the same result. The contradiction was that the writing required accessing the vulnerability, even while the life required suppressing it. To write honestly about loneliness and loss and the desire for connection meant acknowledging that you felt these things. But acknowledging them publicly, outside the controlled space of the poem, was dangerous. The solution was to write about the feelings while maintaining the persona of the man who did not have feelings. This split was visible to careful readers. The poems contained material that the public Bukowski would have mocked. Descriptions of missing someone, fear of abandonment, the pain of isolation. The man who wrote these lines was not the same as the drunk insulting interviewers or picking fights at readings. Or rather, he was the same man containing both aspects. The Bluebird poem was written late in his life, when he was with Linda and relatively stable. The timing suggests that he could acknowledge the vulnerability only after securing some safety. Earlier, when survival was more precarious, admitting to softness would have been too risky. The stability Linda provided created space for the Bluebird to appear in writing, even if it remained hidden in daily life. Women in Bukowski's life often remarked on this split. They saw tenderness and fear and need that was invisible to others. In private, especially when drunk enough to let the guard down, he could be affectionate and even romantic in ways that contradicted his public presentation. But this private self was carefully protected, shown only to people he trusted, and only in circumstances where exposure was limited. The need to hide vulnerability came partly from his childhood. His father had beaten him for showing weakness, for crying or appearing soft. The lesson was clear and reinforced repeatedly. Strength was rewarded, or at least not punished. Weakness invited violence. The pattern established early remained active for decades, shaping how he presented himself even after the original threat was long gone. The drinking served multiple functions in this economy of emotion. It numbed feelings that were too painful to experience directly. It provided excuse for behavior that might otherwise seem weak or needy. If you did something embarrassing while drunk, you could blame the alcohol rather than admitting to the underlying need. The whiskey he poured on the Bluebird was both metaphor and literal description. Readers responded to Bukowski's work partly because they recognized this hidden vulnerability. The surface toughness was obvious, but underneath was something more complex. People who presented hard exteriors to protect soft interiors saw themselves reflected. The recognition created connection, which was ironic given that Bukowski's whole project was about isolation and disconnection. The tough guy persona was also commercially valuable. Readers wanted the hard-drinking, woman-abusing, cynical bastard. That figure was marketable, fit cultural expectations for what a rebel poet should be. The vulnerable, frightened, lonely man was less interesting as a commodity, so the persona was reinforced by audience expectations even when it felt like a trap. Bukowski was aware of this dynamic and resented it. He knew people wanted him to perform the role of Bukowski rather than to simply be himself. But he had created the role, or at least had collaborated in its creation, so he could not entirely blame others for expecting it. The trap was partly self-constructed. Late interviews sometimes caught moments when the mask slipped. He would say something sincere about fearing death, or missing Jane, or feeling grateful for Linda. Then he would recover, make a crude joke, re-establish the persona. The glimpses were brief but revealing. They showed that the hardness was protective rather than essential. His relationship with Linda worked partly because she understood and accepted both aspects. She did not need him to maintain the tough guy act in private. He could be vulnerable with her without facing the ridicule or exploitation he feared from others. This acceptance was rare in his experience and probably necessary for the relationship's success. The Bluebird became a touchstone for readers and critics trying to understand Bukowski's work. It was obvious evidence that the one-dimensional tough guy reading of his persona was incomplete. The poem forced acknowledgement that complexity existed beneath the crude surface. Some readers welcomed this revelation, others felt betrayed, preferring the simpler version. The question the Bluebird raised was whether the vulnerability made the toughness more authentic or less. Was he a hard man who occasionally felt soft emotions, or a soft man who had learned to present himself as hard? The answer probably involved both directions. The vulnerability was real, and so was the protective hardness. Neither was performance exactly, though both involved performance. His childhood experiences with his father appeared throughout his work, usually in tones of anger and resentment. But occasionally the writing revealed something else, a desire for his father's approval that had never been satisfied. The Bluebird wanted the father to see it, to acknowledge it. The father had only offered violence, and the Bluebird had learned to hide. The pattern persisted long after the father died. The fear of exposure was connected to shame. Bukowski felt shame about wanting connection, about needing other people, about the vulnerability that made him human. The culture he grew up in treated these things as weaknesses, especially in men. Showing need was shameful. The shame reinforced the hiding, which reinforced the isolation, which made the need stronger. Breaking this pattern required the kind of safety and acceptance he found only late in life with Linda. Even then, the breaking was partial. He could write the Bluebird poem, could acknowledge the hidden vulnerability in that controlled form. But in daily life, at readings or in interviews, the tough guy persona remained dominant. The Bluebird stayed in its cage most of the time. The power of the poem came from its honesty about the split. Bukowski was not claiming to have overcome the need to hide or to have integrated the vulnerable and tough aspects into some healthy whole. He was simply describing the situation as it existed. There was a Bluebird. He kept it hidden. This caused suffering but seemed necessary. No resolution was offered because no resolution existed. Younger male readers particularly connected with the Bluebird imagery. Many men learned similar lessons about hiding vulnerability, about presenting hardness regardless of what they actually feel. The poem validated their experience while also suggesting that the hiding came at a cost. The Bluebird was still there even when buried, and keeping it buried required constant effort. The poem's ending was ambiguous. Bukowski wrote that he poured whiskey on the bird and told it to shut up. Then he added that the bird was still there, tough as he was. The final line suggested both continued suppression and acknowledgement that the vulnerability could not be completely eliminated. The Bluebird survived despite everything he did to silence it. This survival was both hopeful and sad. Hopeful because it meant the capacity for feeling had not been completely destroyed by the years of hardship and self-protection. Sad because it meant decades of denying an essential part of himself, of living divided, of showing only acceptable portions of his humanity to the world. The Bluebird represented what Bukowski might have been if circumstances had been different. If his father had not beaten him, if his face had not erupted with acne, if his early writing had been accepted rather than rejected. A gentler version might have emerged, less defended, more openly vulnerable, but that version would not have survived the life he actually lived, or would not have survived intact. The actual Bukowski was the result of adaptation to harsh conditions. The toughness and cynicism and emotional distance were survival strategies that had worked well enough to keep him alive and functioning. The cost was the Bluebird kept in hiding, the parts of himself he could not safely express. Whether this trade-off was worth it is a question without a clear answer. What seems certain is that Bukowski himself thought the trade-off was necessary. He did not write the Bluebird poem as a rejection of the tough guy persona, or as a claim that he should have lived differently. He wrote it as description of how things were, the price paid for surviving, the vulnerability that persisted despite all attempts to eliminate it. The bird was there, would always be there, hidden but alive. Among the defeated, solidarity without salvation. Bukowski came from the working class and never left it psychologically, even after achieving financial success. His father had worked as a milkman, a job that required physical labor and provided minimal income. His own employment history before becoming a full-time writer consisted of low-wage jobs that offered no future. He understood working-class life from the inside, not as an observer or sociologist, but as someone who had lived it. His loyalty to working-class people and perspectives remained consistent throughout his writing. He did not romanticize workers or claim they were morally superior to other classes. He portrayed them accurately as people struggling to survive, often failing, sometimes mean or stupid or self-destructive. But they were his people, and he refused to betray them by adopting middle-class values or pretending he had transcended his origins. The working-class world he described was not the heroic proletariat of Marxist theory. These were not workers organizing for revolution or developing class consciousness. They were people too tired and beaten down to imagine alternatives to their circumstances. They worked because they needed money, drank to make the work tolerable, aged badly, and died without having changed anything. There was no redemption in this narrative, no suggestion that their suffering was building towards something better. Bukowski's co-workers at the post office appeared frequently in his writing. They were not heroes or villains, but ordinary people trapped in a system that used them. Some accepted the trap and tried to find small satisfactions within it. Others were miserable but saw no escape. Bukowski described both types without judgment, recognizing that everyone was managing impossible circumstances as best they could. The bars he frequented were working-class spaces. The customers were manual laborers, service workers, the unemployed, people on the margins of the economy. They drank cheap beer and well liquor, watched sports on television, engaged in conversations that went nowhere. These were not intellectual gatherings or bohemian hangouts. They were places where people went to escape their lives temporarily. Bukowski felt comfortable in these spaces in ways he never felt comfortable in middle-class or literary settings. The bars required no performance, no pretense of sophistication or education. You could sit and drink and be left alone or have simple conversations about nothing important. The social expectations were minimal and within his capacity to meet. When he started achieving literary success, Bukowski encountered middle-class and upper-middle-class people regularly: publishers, editors, journalists, academics. He found these interactions difficult and often hostile. The class differences were obvious in language, in assumptions, in what topics were considered appropriate or important. He felt like an outsider in these settings and responded by emphasizing his working-class origins and refusing to adopt middle-class manners. This refusal was partly defensive and partly principled. Defensive because adopting middle-class behavior would have required acknowledging that their way was correct and his way was deficient. Principled because he genuinely believed working-class honesty and directness were superior to middle-class politeness and evasion. The crudeness he maintained was both authentic expression and political statement. His readers from working-class backgrounds recognized and appreciated this loyalty. They saw someone who had escaped poverty through writing but had not become respectable, had not abandoned the people and places he came from. This was unusual enough to be remarkable. Most writers who came from working-class origins moved toward middle-class culture as they achieved success. Bukowski stayed where he was psychologically even as his bank account changed. The solidarity he expressed was not sentimental. He did not claim that working-class people were inherently good or that poverty ennobled people. His writing showed working-class characters being cruel, stupid, racist, sexist, all the things people from any class could be. But they were real, and their reality deserved documentation regardless of whether it was flattering. The economic system that created and maintained the working class appeared in his work as background condition rather than explicit focus. He was not writing political analysis or advocating for specific reforms. But the system was always there, determining who worked what jobs for what wages, who had options and who did not. The characters existed within this system and were shaped by it. Bukowski's own relationship to work and money was shaped by working-class experience. He understood that money represented hours of your life sold. The more money you had, the fewer hours you needed to sell. Achieving financial independence through writing meant he no longer had to sell his time, which was liberation. But he remembered what it felt like to have no choice, to need the job regardless of how much you hated it. This memory prevented him from becoming completely separated from working-class consciousness, even after he no longer needed to work. He knew that his situation was unusual, that most people who grew up as he did would work low-wage jobs until they died. His escape did not mean the system had changed or that escape was generally available. It meant he had been lucky in ways most people were not. The working class ethic of not complaining appeared in his work as a specific value. You dealt with your problems without whining about them. Self-pity was shameful. This ethic could be toxic, preventing people from acknowledging genuine injustice or seeking help. But it also reflected a realistic understanding that complaining changed nothing. The system did not care about your complaints, so you kept them to yourself and endured. Bukowski's writing about work was from the perspective of someone who hated it, but did it anyway. This was different from the perspective of writers who found meaning in work or who wrote about work as a site of potential dignity and fulfillment. His work was just work, something you did because capitalism required it, not because it provided satisfaction or identity. The class resentment in his writing was directed upward, toward people with wealth and education who looked down on workers. He had contempt for the comfortable who had never experienced real poverty, who had safety nets and options that working class people lacked. Their advice about hard work and personal responsibility seemed obscene when delivered by people who had inherited advantages. But he also had contempt for working class people who accepted middle class values, who believed the system was fair and that anyone could succeed through effort. These people had internalized the ideology that justified their own exploitation. They blamed themselves for their failures, rather than recognizing the structural nature of their situation. Bukowski found this self-blame pathetic and infuriating. His politics, insofar as he had coherent politics, were anti-authoritarian rather than specifically leftist. He distrusted anyone with power, whether government officials or corporate executives or union leaders. Power corrupted reliably, and the powerful used their positions to exploit those beneath them. The working class was exploited, but organizing to resist the exploitation just created new hierarchies and new forms of exploitation. This skepticism about organized resistance meant Bukowski offered no political solutions in his work. He described the problem, the way working class people were used and discarded, but provided no program for changing things. Some critics saw this as political failure, an inability to move beyond complaint to action. Bukowski would have said that political programs were usually scams run by people seeking power for themselves. His solidarity with working class people was expressed through accurate representation rather than through activism or organizing. He wrote about their lives honestly, without condescension or romanticism. This was his contribution, making visible what mainstream culture preferred to ignore. The value of this representation was debated, but for many working-class readers, it mattered that someone was telling their stories. The defeated people in Bukowski's work were not defeated because they lacked courage or determination. They were defeated because the system was designed to defeat them. A few individuals might escape through luck or exceptional talent, but most would not. The individual success stories that capitalism celebrated were exceptions that proved the rule rather than evidence that the system was fair. Bukowski's own success did not contradict this analysis. He had escaped, but not through the normal channels of hard work and following rules. He had escaped by refusing to play the game properly, by writing exactly what he wanted without regard for marketability, by staying outside the system long enough that the system eventually came to him. This path was not replicable as general strategy. In his final years, living comfortably in San Pedro, Bukowski remained psychologically connected to working-class experience even though his current circumstances were different. He remembered what it felt like to be broke and trapped. The memory informed his continued writing about poverty and work. He was not betraying his origins by accepting money for his work. He was using the platform success provided to keep telling working-class stories. The question his position raised was whether accurate representation was sufficient as a political act. Some argued that his work reinforced hopelessness, showing working-class life as unrelentingly grim without suggesting possibility of change. Others argued that honesty about conditions was necessary first step, that false optimism served the system's interests by concealing how bad things actually were. Bukowski never claimed his work would change anything. He was not writing to start a revolution or to inspire the working class to rise up. He was writing because it was what he did, because these were the stories he knew. If the stories helped some readers feel less alone in their experience, that was valuable. But social transformation was not the goal and probably not possible through literature anyway. His legacy among working-class readers is significant and ongoing. New generations discover his work and recognize their own experiences in it. The economic conditions that produced his subject matter have not improved and in many ways have worsened. Working-class life remains difficult, exploitative, often hopeless. Bukowski's documentation of that reality remains relevant because the reality persists. Barfly, Selling Your Life to Hollywood. In 1987, a film called Barfly was released, based on a screenplay written by Bukowski and depicting a fictionalized version of his life as a young drunk in Los Angeles. The production brought Bukowski into direct contact with Hollywood, the entertainment industry he had always viewed with suspicion and contempt. The experience confirmed many of his prejudices, while also providing him with the largest paycheck he had ever received. The screenplay had been written years earlier, during the late 1970s. Bukowski had never written for film before and approached it as he approached everything else, writing what he knew about directly and honestly. The script followed the character Henry Chinaski, his alter ego, through days and nights of drinking, fighting, and attempting to write while living in extreme poverty. Getting the script produced took years. Hollywood was not interested in a film about an alcoholic loser with no redemption arc. The character did not learn lessons or overcome his problems. He just continued drinking and surviving. This was not the structure that commercial films followed. Producers who read the script recognized that it was well written but could not see how to market it. The film eventually got made through the efforts of Barbet Schroeder, a French director who admired Bukowski's work and was willing to fight to get the project financed. Schroeder threatened to cut off his own finger if the studio would not fund the film, a gesture that got publicity and eventually helped secure financing. The story became part of the film's mythology, evidence of the dedication required to make uncommercial art in a commercial system. Mickey Rourke was cast as Henry Chinaski. Rourke in the late 1980s was known for playing rough characters and brought physicality and credibility to the role. Faye Dunaway played the female lead, a drunk who becomes Henry's girlfriend. The casting was solid, actors who could handle the material without sanitizing it. Bukowski was involved in the production, visiting the set and watching filming. The experience was strange for him. Seeing actors perform scenes based on his life, watching Hollywood recreate the cheap bars and rooms he had actually lived in, all of it felt surreal. The industry was trying to capture something authentic using methods that were inherently artificial. He clashed with some of the production people. Hollywood worked through hierarchy and protocol, things Bukowski had no patience for. He said what he thought directly, which violated industry norms where criticism was delivered carefully through proper channels. Some people found him refreshing, others found him difficult and unprofessional. The financial aspect of the deal was significant. Bukowski received more money for the screenplay than he had earned from years of publishing books and poems. The sum was not enormous by Hollywood standards but was life-changing for him. It provided security he had never had, removed the constant financial pressure that had characterized his entire adult life. This created the ethical complication. He had always positioned himself against commercialism, against selling out, against compromising his work for money. Now he was taking Hollywood's money, participating in the commercial entertainment system. The contradiction was obvious, and his critics pointed to it. Was he a hypocrite for taking the money after decades of criticizing people who made commercial compromises? Bukowski's defense was that he had not compromised the work. The screenplay was honest as anything he had written. Hollywood had chosen to produce it knowing what it was. He had not changed the material to make it more commercial. If they wanted to pay him for work that maintained his integrity, he would take the money. The sale was not a betrayal because nothing had been betrayed. This argument was not entirely convincing. The act of writing for Hollywood at all involved certain compromises built into the medium. Film required specific structures, had technical requirements, needed to work within time constraints. Bukowski had adapted his material to fit these requirements, which was a form of compromise even if he maintained thematic honesty. The film itself was well received critically, but not a commercial success. It was too dark and too uncommercial for mainstream audiences. The people who might have enjoyed it, Bukowski's existing readers, were not necessarily film audiences. The movie found its audience eventually through video and cable television, where it developed a cult following. Bukowski's reaction to seeing the finished film was mixed. He thought Rourke had done good work capturing the character. He thought some scenes worked well, but the overall experience of watching his life depicted by actors in a Hollywood production felt wrong. The reality had been uglier and more boring than the film showed. Film required compression and drama that falsified the actual experience of slowly drinking yourself toward death. The Barfly experience opened doors to more Hollywood opportunities. Other producers and directors contacted him about writing more screenplays or adapting his books. He wrote a few more scripts, none of which got produced. The screenwriting provided income but did not become a major part of his work. He remained primarily a poet and prose writer, using Hollywood when it paid without dedicating himself to it. The success of Barfly increased his fame substantially. People who had never read his books saw the movie and became interested in the writer behind it. His readings drew larger crowds. publishers pushed his books more aggressively. The movie served as marketing for his literary work, which was probably the most valuable thing it did for him. But the fame was complicated. Many of the people who discovered him through Barfly had a shallow understanding of his work. They liked the image of the drunk writer more than they understood what his writing was actually doing. They wanted the performance, the tough guy persona, not the complexity underneath. This created pressure to continue performing in ways that were exhausting. The Hollywood experience also exposed him to a level of phoniness that was extreme, even by his standards. The industry operated through flattery and lies. People told you they loved your work when they were really calculating how to profit from it. Relationships were transactional, based entirely on what each party could provide the other. The artificiality was complete. Bukowski wrote about the Hollywood experience in his later work, capturing the absurdity and the corruption. The writing maintained his voice and perspective, turning the experience into material. But there was also a sense that Hollywood had defeated him in some way. He had engaged with the system and survived, had taken their money without completely selling out, but the engagement had cost something. The question the Barfly experience raised was whether it was possible to work with Hollywood without being corrupted by it. Bukowski tried to maintain his integrity while taking their money, and he succeeded to a degree. But the act of participation legitimized the system in some way. He had become a Hollywood writer, even if he was a reluctant and critical one. For fans who valued his outsider status, the Hollywood involvement was disappointing. It suggested that everyone had a price, that sufficient money could bring anyone inside the system they claimed to reject. Bukowski was aware of this perception and resented it, but he also understood why people felt that way. The appearance of selling out was hard to avoid when you literally sold your work to Hollywood. His relationship with money remained complicated after Barfly. He had gone from poverty to relative wealth quickly. The transition was disorienting. He no longer had to worry about rent or food, could afford medical care, lived in a nice house. These were positive changes that improved his life, but they also separated him from the poverty that had shaped his perspective and provided his material. The late work written after achieving financial security had a different quality than the desperate early work. It was more reflective, less urgent. The change was inevitable. A comfortable man writes differently than a desperate man. Some readers preferred the comfortable period work, finding it more mature. Others missed the edge that came from actual struggling. Bukowski himself seemed ambivalent about the success Barfly brought. He appreciated the money and the security. He enjoyed being recognized and having his work taken seriously. But he also missed the clarity of his earlier position, when the opposition between himself and the mainstream was absolute. Success had compromised that clarity, made him part of the system he had spent his life criticizing. Sex, honesty, and the body. Bukowski wrote about sex more explicitly and frequently than most literary writers of his era. The sex in his work was graphic, often crude, described in physical detail without romantic overlay. This directness was shocking to some readers and liberating to others. He was refusing to comply with literary conventions that treated sex as something to be implied or described tastefully. The sex he depicted was usually not about love or deep connection. It was about physical need, temporary relief from loneliness, two bodies meeting for mutual use. The encounters were often awkward, sometimes failed, frequently disappointing. This was closer to actual experience than the romantic or erotic ideals promoted by mainstream culture. His descriptions focused on bodies as physical objects rather than as vessels for souls or as symbols of deeper meaning. A woman's body was described with the same directness he used to describe a car or a building. The breasts, the legs, the genitals, all specific and material. This approach was sometimes called objectifying, and it was, but Bukowski would have said he was just being honest about how sexual attraction and sex itself actually worked. The honesty extended to his own body. He wrote about his aging flesh, his declining sexual function, the physical reality of being an older man still driven by sexual desire but less capable of satisfying it. Most writers avoided this material, finding it undignified or too embarrassing. Bukowski documented it with the same attention he gave to everything else. The women in his sexual writing were individuals to the extent that he could perceive them as such, but his perception was limited by his own needs and perspective. He saw them primarily through the lens of sexual availability and physical appearance. Their inner lives, their own desires and fears, received less attention. This was honest about his limitations, but also demonstrated those limitations. His approach to writing about sex violated taboos that still had force in mid-20th century American literature. Serious literary fiction could be sexually frank, but generally maintained some aesthetic distance, used metaphor, avoided explicit description of genitals and sexual acts, Pornography was explicit but was not considered literature. Bukowski violated this boundary, writing with literary ambitions about material that was pornographically explicit. The cultural response was divided. Some critics dismissed his work as pornographic, not worthy of serious attention. Others recognized that he was documenting an aspect of human experience that literary fiction generally avoided. The explicit sex was part of his larger project of writing honestly about working-class life, and sex was a significant part of that life. Bukowski's sexual ethics, as they appeared in his writing and life, were straightforward. Sex between consenting adults was fine. No one owed anyone else sex or fidelity unless they had agreed to it. Romantic love was mostly self-delusion, but physical pleasure was real and worth pursuing. These principles were simple, but contradicted prevailing morality around relationships and sexuality. The physical descriptions in his work were often unflattering to both parties. Bodies were described as flawed, marked by age or excess or neglect. The sex itself was described as messy, sometimes comical, not the idealized encounter promoted by either pornography or romance. This demystification was part of his larger project of showing life without the usual beautification. His writing about prostitution was matter of fact. He had used prostitutes when younger and wrote about those experiences without moral judgment. The transaction was clear, money for sex, and the clarity made it honest in ways that relationships based on unstated exchanges were not. The prostitute provided a service, he paid for it, both parties understood what was happening. This attitude toward prostitution was consistent with his broader view that all interactions under capitalism were transactional. Employment was selling your body and time. Marriage often involved economic exchange disguised as love. Prostitution was just more honest about the transaction, which made it less hypocritical than relationships where the economic elements were concealed. The sex in his writing served multiple functions. It was entertainment, part of what attracted readers to his work. It was documentation of actual experience, recording what happened without moral commentary. It was also a way to confront conventional morality, to insist that this aspect of life deserved the same honest attention as any other aspect. As he aged, the relationship between his body and his desires became more complicated. He still wanted sex, but was less capable of performing sexually in ways that matched his desires. This created frustration and sometimes humiliation. He wrote about this situation honestly, showing the gap between what the aging body wanted and what it could actually do. His relationship with Linda in his final years involved sex, but not with the frequency or intensity of his earlier relationships. They had a companionate relationship where sex was one element among others rather than the primary connection. This shift reflected his age and declining health, but also perhaps represented a different understanding of what relationships could provide. The male sexual anxiety present throughout his work was never fully resolved. The worry about performance, about satisfying the woman, about being judged as inadequate, all of this appeared repeatedly. Bukowski was honest about these fears, but did not overcome them. They remained part of his experience, limiting his relationships and creating recurring problems. His writing about the female body was criticized for reducing women to physical attributes, for failing to see them as full human beings. The criticism had validity. Bukowski's perspective was limited by his own needs and by the culture that had formed him. He wrote from a position of male heterosexual desire that often did not extend beyond physical attraction to recognition of the woman's subjectivity. But within those limitations, he was describing something real about how many men experience sexual attraction and sexual relationships. The honest portrayal of limited male perspective had value even if the limitation itself was problematic. Readers, both male and female, could recognize the truth of the portrayal even while wishing the reality was different. The rawness of his sexual writing made some readers uncomfortable, particularly when it involved violence or coercion. There were scenes in his work where consent was ambiguous, where drunk people had sex without clear agreement, where anger and sex were mixed. He was documenting experiences that happened but that polite literature avoided. The documentation forced readers to confront realities they preferred to ignore. Bukowski did not write about sex to titillate, though some readers were titillated. He wrote about it because it was there, because it was part of life as he experienced it, because leaving it out would have falsified the picture. The explicitness was in service of completeness, an attempt to show all aspects of human experience without the usual censorship. The body in Bukowski's work was never transcended. It was not overcome through spiritual development or transformed through art. It remained stubbornly material, subject to needs and appetites, aging and breaking down, dying. This materialism was part of his rejection of romantic and religious frameworks that treated the body as inferior to the soul or spirit. His honesty about the body and sex extended to acknowledging pleasure. He did not treat physical pleasure as shameful or as something to be guilty about. Sex felt good when it worked, drinking provided relief, food satisfied hunger. These were legitimate experiences worth having, even if they came with costs. The puritanical denial of pleasure struck him as dishonest and probably impossible to maintain anyway. Don't Try: The Philosophy of Effortless Creation and the Bukowski Legacy. On Bukowski's gravestone are two words, "Don't try." The phrase came from his writing, where he had said that if you had to try hard to write, you were not a real writer. Real writing happened naturally, flowing from necessity rather than effort. The phrase became his epitaph and summarized his approach to both writing and living. The philosophy of effortlessness was central to how Bukowski understood creative work. Trying meant forcing something that should happen naturally. It meant writing to meet external standards rather than internal necessity. It meant editing and polishing and crafting when the real value came from immediate expression. Trying produced dead prose, work that showed the effort that went into it. This approach violated everything taught in creative writing programs and craft-focused workshops. Those environments emphasized revision, careful attention to structure and language, learning techniques through practice. Bukowski dismissed all of that as missing the point. Either you had something to say or you did not. If you had it, writing was easy. If you did not have it, no amount of craft instruction would help. The don't try philosophy extended beyond writing to life generally. Do not try to be something you are not. Do not force relationships or career paths that feel unnatural. Do not strain after goals that do not arise organically from your actual desires. Let things happen or not happen based on what naturally emerges rather than what you think should happen. This sounded like laziness to critics and to people who valued ambition and effort. But Bukowski was not advocating for doing nothing. He produced an enormous volume of work through constant writing. The point was that the work came naturally, from compulsion, rather than from discipline imposed from outside. He wrote because he needed to write, not because he had a schedule to maintain. The distinction between natural effortless work and lazy avoidance was important. Bukowski wrote every day, maintained productivity over decades. He was not avoiding work, he was avoiding forced work, work that required trying in the sense of performing contrary to natural inclination. The work that flowed naturally was sustainable. The work that required constant effort against resistance would eventually break you. This philosophy resonated with readers who felt trapped in situations that required constant effort to maintain, jobs that demanded you perform a role alien to your nature, relationships that required constant management and suppression of your actual feelings, social obligations that felt like performances. All of this was trying in the negative sense, effort spent maintaining something that was fundamentally wrong for you. The cultural response to "don't try" divided along predictable lines. People who valued discipline and effort saw it as promoting laziness and lack of responsibility. People who felt crushed by excessive demands and expectations saw it as liberating permission to stop forcing things. Both interpretations had some validity depending on who was applying the principle and in what circumstances. For creative work specifically, the don't try philosophy meant trusting intuition and first impulse over revision and calculation. Bukowski's writing method reflected this. He wrote quickly, usually did not revise extensively, trusted that what came out first was closest to truth. This produced uneven work, some brilliant and some merely adequate. But it maintained a quality of immediacy that heavy revision would have destroyed. The legacy of this approach in American literature is significant. Subsequent writers adopted elements of Bukowski's method, the direct, unpolished style, the trust in first impulse. Some did this successfully, producing work that maintained energy and honesty. Others used it as excuse for laziness, publishing work that needed more attention than it received. Bukowski's approach worked for him, but was not universally applicable. His influence extended beyond professional writers to people who wrote as part of living rather than as career. The don't try philosophy validated the journal keeper, the blogger, the person who wrote for personal necessity rather than for publication. If writing was about expressing something necessary rather than about craft and achievement, then anyone with something necessary to express was a legitimate writer. This democratization of writing threatened the gatekeepers and experts who made their living from teaching writing or from determining who deserved to be published. If Bukowski was right that craft instruction was mostly useless and that gatekeepers had no legitimate authority, then their positions were unjustified. They responded by dismissing him as unserious, not a real writer despite his obvious productivity and influence. The don't try philosophy applied to his reading habits as well. He read widely and without system, picking up books that interested him and abandoning them if they became boring. He did not feel obligated to finish books or to read what critics said was important. This approach meant he missed significant works, but also meant he only spent time on writing that engaged him. The efficiency was consistent with his broader approach of not wasting effort on things that felt forced. His influence on subsequent generations has been enormous and varied. Every few years, a new cohort of young writers discovers Bukowski and finds in his work validation for their own rejection of conventional paths. They adopt his style, his attitudes, his approach to creating. Some of this is superficial imitation, copying the drinking and the attitude without understanding the underlying commitment to honesty. The serious inheritors of Bukowski's approach are writers who understand that don't try means writing from necessity rather than from ambition, maintaining honesty rather than pursuing literary respectability. These writers exist across genres and styles, not necessarily writing like Bukowski, but sharing his fundamental orientation toward the work. His legacy also includes the permission to write about previously taboo subjects and to write about them directly without literary ornamentation. The explicit sex, the focus on poverty and failure, the crude language, all of this became more acceptable in literature, partly because Bukowski demonstrated that it could be done and that audiences existed for it. The commercial success his work achieved after his death is ironic given his anti-commercial stance. His books continue selling steadily, finding new readers who connect with the voice and perspective. Publishers have released numerous posthumous collections, some of questionable quality, capitalizing on his name. The commodification he resisted while alive continues accelerating after his death. But the work itself resists complete commodification. The honesty remains accessible to readers despite whatever marketing surrounds it. A new reader can still encounter Bukowski's actual voice and perspective without requiring extensive literary education or cultural capital. The accessibility was always part of the point, making the work available to people who had been excluded from literary culture. His influence in Europe, particularly Germany, has remained stronger than in the United States. European readers seem more comfortable with his uncompromising attitude and his refusal to provide redemption. American culture prefers success stories, narratives of overcoming. Bukowski provided neither, which limited his acceptance in his home country, while paradoxically increasing his appeal elsewhere. The question his legacy raises is whether his approach is applicable beyond his specific circumstances. He was formed by particular experiences, wrote during a specific cultural moment, succeeded partly through luck and timing. Later writers trying to follow his path faced different circumstances. The underground literary scene that supported him no longer exists in the same form. Commercial publishing has changed. Digital media has created new possibilities and new problems. But the core of Don't Try remains relevant. Do not force yourself to be something you are not. Do not write to meet external expectations. Trust what comes naturally. These principles apply regardless of changing circumstances. The application looks different now, but the underlying philosophy retains validity. Bukowski's death in 1994 ended his production but did not end his presence in American and world literature. The work continues finding readers, continues influencing how people think about writing and living. The epitaph he chose, Don't Try, encapsulates the philosophy that guided his life and work. It is both instruction and summary, both advice and self-description. The instruction is to stop trying in the sense of forcing things contrary to your nature. Stop performing for others. Stop shaping yourself to meet external expectations. Find what comes naturally and do that, even if it leads to poverty or obscurity or rejection. The alternative is a life spent in permanent performance, exhausting and inauthentic. The summary is that Bukowski lived according to this principle, refusing to try in ways that would have required betraying himself. He wrote what needed to be written. He lived as he needed to live. The cost was high in conventional terms, decades of poverty and obscurity. The reward was a body of work that was genuinely his own, that could not have been produced by anyone else, that continues speaking to readers decades after his death.